If you study a crime scene long enough, the bodies stop being the story. What comes forward instead is the chain of decisions that put them there. Most true crime gives you a killer, a victim, and a motive. This case gives you none of those in the usual shape. The killer is a process with no mind and no malice. The weapon is a promise of unlimited energy. And the victims number in the millions, spread across 3 centuries, 4 governments, 1 corporation, 1 religion, and roughly a dozen worlds where nobody survived to file a complaint. We tend to remember Dead Space as a series of separate nightmares. A mining ship gone quiet, a city on a moon fragment, a frozen planet at the edge of everything. Arrange the incident reports chronologically, though, and stack the medical logs beside the shipping manifests, and those separate nightmares turn out to be one continuous event that began before our species existed. It starts 65 million years ago, with an object falling into shallow water off what is now the Yucatan Peninsula. The sky goes white, then black, and almost everything on Earth dies. That part you already know. What almost nobody sits with is the second half of it. Something survived down there in the crater, something patient, and 65 million years later, a research team pulled it out of the mud, looked at the readings, and decided it was the answer to every problem the human race had left. This video is analytical commentary and interpretation of the Dead Space series, examining how the games use fictional horror to explore real patterns, how institutions convert warnings into paperwork, how grief becomes a lever, how the people who authorize a risk are never the people who absorb it. By the end, you will understand something the games only ever whisper. Every disaster in this franchise happened for reasons that had nothing to do with monsters. Insomnia came before the violence came before the dead, and the dead were always the point. If something in this video lands for you, drop a comment and tell me what it was. Maybe a detail you had never noticed, a connection you made on your own, or just a moment that stayed with you. Suggestions for future videos are always welcome too. And some of the best episodes here started as a throwaway line in a comment section. So now get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's open the file. Chapter 1. The first ones to try. We have to start before humanity, because the crime scene predates the criminals. Roughly 2 million years ago, on a world that would eventually be catalogued by human astronomers as Tau Volantis, another species found a marker. Who they were is not fully explained. What they looked like at the height of their civilization, what they called themselves, whether they had families, or art, or grief, none of that survives in the record. All that remains are their buildings, their machines, and their bodies. And the bodies are the wrong shape now because of what they did to themselves at the end. Picture the discovery, not the horror of it, the ordinariness of it. A species with technology, with cities, with a scientific establishment, comes across an object that produces energy without any visible source and without any apparent limit. It does not attack them. It does not make demands. It sits there, radiating a signal, and it seems to want nothing at all. That indifference is the most important detail in this entire timeline, so hold on to it. What the aliens of Tau Volantis did next is the thing that ties them to every human being who comes later in this story. They studied the object, they learned enough to imitate it, and then they built copies, brother moons, called forth across the surface of their world, the result of scaling a process they did not fully understand, deployed in the hope of harvesting more of the energy they had found. Their reasoning is not recorded in detail, though the shape of it is easy enough to read from the outcome. A civilization does not mass-produce something unless it believes the first one was insufficient. They were scaling up. Here is where the analysis has to slow down, because this is the pattern that repeats 4 separate times across 3 centuries, and if you catch it now, you will see it coming in every chapter that follows. Research into how organizations handle unfamiliar risk describes something often called the normalization of deviance. The idea is simple. A group encounters a warning sign, nothing catastrophic happens immediately, and the warning sign gets quietly reclassified as normal. Next time the threshold moves a little further, each individual step is defensible. The cumulative path is not. Investigations into real industrial and aerospace disasters have found this pattern again and again, and the finding that unsettles people most is that it does not require anyone to be reckless or stupid. It requires only that the reward is visible and the danger is delayed. The markers exploit that gap perfectly. Free energy is immediate, measurable, and career-defining. The consequence arrives later, arrives slowly, and arrives disguised as a medical problem rather than an engineering one. For the aliens, the consequence arrived as convergence. The black marker triggered a convergence event on their world, and out of that event came something the human record would later name a brethren moon. Understanding what that phrase means requires setting aside every instinct you have about what an alien invasion looks like. Nothing landed. Nothing declared war. The living matter of a civilization was gathered, fused, and rebuilt at a scale that turned biology into geology. A moon made of what used to be people, and their answer to this, at the very last moment, was a machine. They built a device capable of flash freezing their entire planet. Everything stopped. The ice took the surface, the convergence halted mid-process, and the thing that had been assembling itself out of their species was locked in place, incomplete, suspended, waiting. They saved the galaxy. They did not save themselves. Every one of them died, and their world became a tomb with a machine humming at the center of it. Think about what that decision actually required. A species stared at the end of itself and chose to make the end permanent rather than let the process finish. There is no negotiation in that choice, no clever escape, no hero flying up to punch the sky. Someone had to make the ice, and someone had to switch it on. Knowing the switch was also their own execution. What survives of them is not a monument, it is a lock, and the key is still in it. The second thing worth noticing is that they, too, are a mystery to themselves in the record. Nothing explains where their black marker came from. Nothing explains who made the original object, or whether "made" is even the right word for it. The chain of custody on this artifact goes backward past the first known intelligent species that touched it, and then it just ends. That gap is not something I am going to fill in for you with a theory dressed up as fact, because the material genuinely does not answer it. What the material does establish is the shape of the process, and the shape is the horror. Consider it as a life cycle rather than as a weapon. A signal draws intelligence toward an object. Intelligence studies the object and reproduces it. Reproduction accelerates exposure. Exposure produces dementia, sleeplessness, hallucination, violence. Violence produces the dead. The dead become the raw material. Enough raw material produces a convergence, and convergence produces a new brethren moon, which broadcasts a signal that draws the next intelligence toward the next object. Nothing in that cycle requires malice. A tick does not hate the animal it feeds on. The tick simply has a life cycle, and the animal is a step in it. That framing makes people uncomfortable, and it should, because it removes the thing horror usually gives us for free. There is no villain here to be angry at. Anger needs a target with a motive, and this system has no motive that a human mind can hold on to. It has a function. The aliens of Tau Volantis are important for a second reason, one that only becomes clear centuries later, and I want to plant it here so it can grow while we are elsewhere. They did not stop the process because they defeated it. Freezing the planet was containment. Somebody eventually arrives, which brings us to the object that fell into the Gulf of Mexico, and to the fact that it did not fall into an empty world. That final point is where this chapter stops being ancient history and starts being about us. When the black marker was carried to Earth, the extinction it caused cleared the ground for the mammals, and from the mammals came the primates, and from the primates came the species reading warning labels 300 years from now. The object that killed the dinosaurs is the same object that made room for people. Read that as coincidence if you want. The timeline records it as sequence, and sequence is what investigators live on. 65 million years of quiet follows. Continents move. Ice comes and goes. The crater fills, then floods, then becomes seafloor, and above it a species learns to farm, to write, to argue, to build engines and then better engines. By the middle of the 21st century, That species has put a permanent colony on its own moon and started fighting over what it finds there. By the 23rd century, with the environment failing and the resources gone and the politics unstable, an Earth flying a single flag turns outward and starts throwing colonies at distant stars, escorted by soldiers, funded by corporations, driven by the oldest motive in the book. They needed power. They needed it badly enough to stop asking careful questions. Underneath the Gulf of Mexico, something that had been waiting 65 million years was about to be asked exactly the wrong question by exactly the right man. Chapter 2: The Man Who Said No. The year is 2214. We are at the bottom of the Chicxulub crater, and everything you are about to hear happens to people who thought they were doing good work. A gravitational anomaly draws a research operation to the site. Among the personnel is a geophysicist named Michael Altman, and it is worth being precise about who he was, because 300 years later he becomes something unrecognizable. He was a scientist, not a prophet, not a revolutionary, not a man with a following. He studied the shape and behavior of a planet, and an anomaly in the data was, to him, a problem to be solved. They found the marker at the center of the crater, roughly 2 meters of black material, twisted into a double spiral, harder than corundum, without a scratch on it after 65 million years in the ground. Tools would not damage it, bullets would not damage it. A drill managed to take a small sample, and that small sample was enough to end an era. The initial assessment was that the object was a source of limitless energy. Sit with the wording, limitless. In a century where humanity is bleeding out from resource shortage, where colonies are expensive and fragile, and war is already brewing over what is left, the word limitless is not a scientific finding, it is a lottery ticket. It changes the incentives of every person standing in that room before anyone has run a second test. And then the second thing began, quietly, the way these things always begin. People at the site started to lose sleep. Then they started seeing things that were not there. What made the hallucinations effective, and what makes them the cruelest detail in the entire franchise, is that they were not random. The visions were personal. They came wearing the faces of the dead, speaking with the authority of people the victim had loved and lost. Grief was the delivery mechanism. Altman watched this happen around him. He watched people go from tired to unreliable to dangerous. Some turned on others, some turned on themselves. A researcher who had been perfectly stable in the morning would be gone by the following night, taken by their own hand or by someone else's. Here is the detail that separates him from everyone else at the excavation. The marker's effects did not take hold of him the way they took hold of the others. He remained able to see the situation clearly, while the people around him could not. That is a nightmare in its own right. Imagine being the only person in a building who can smell the gas leak, surrounded by colleagues who keep telling you the air is fine, and reaching for the light switch. The Necromorphs came next. The first recorded outbreak devastated the research facility above the crater. Bodies that should have stayed still did not stay still. The reanimation is not resurrection, and it is important to be careful about the language, because the difference is the whole point. Nothing of the person comes back. The corpse is reorganized into a shape optimized for spreading the problem further. The recognizable parts remain visible, which is precisely why it works as horror. You are looking at somebody you knew, restructured by something that regarded them as material. Altman did what a scientist is supposed to do when a project becomes a hazard to the public. He went public. He revealed the existence of the black marker to the world, directly against the wishes of the government running the site. That single act is the fork in the road for the next 3 centuries, and I want to analyze it properly, instead of just admiring him for it, because the interesting part is not the courage. The interesting part is what an institution does when a member breaks containment. Research on organizational whistleblowing describes a consistent pattern in how institutions respond to internal warnings. The initial response is rarely a debate about whether the warning is accurate. The initial response is a reframing of the person raising it. The dispute gets converted from a question about the hazard into a question about the individual. And once it is a question about the individual, the institution is on ground it knows how to win. Loyalty, stability, and reputation are the vocabulary that follows. Very often the warning turns out to have been correct, and very often that correctness makes the institution's reaction more severe rather than less, because now the record has to be managed as well as the person. That is exactly the machinery that closes around Altman. He was killed on March the 15th, 2208, at the hands of former members of the project, not by an outside enemy, by colleagues, men who had stood in the same rooms, read the same data, and understood better than anyone what the object could do. Now understand what happens next, because this is where the crime becomes a conspiracy. His death was not a cover-up in the ordinary sense. A cover-up hides a thing. What was done here was more sophisticated. The men who killed him took the story of his death and built something out of it. His name went on a religion. His murder became a martyrdom. The scientist who spent his final months trying to warn the human race away from the object became, in the retelling, the man who revealed its holy promise. There is no cleaner example anywhere in fiction of a message being inverted by the people who silenced its messenger. And the inversion held. It held for 300 years. It held because it was more useful than the truth to everyone who mattered. The government got the object without the scrutiny. The new church got a founder who could never contradict them, since the dead make excellent spokesmen. And the public got a story with a villain and a saint in it, which is always easier to carry than a story about an artifact that has no intentions at all. The black marker itself does not survive the incident intact. What matters for everything that follows is that the codes were taken. The knowledge extracted from Altman's work went into government hands, and government hands do not sit still with a discovery like that. Before we move on, I want to return to one moment, because the analysis needs grounding in something you can see. Picture the excavation site at night. Floodlights on the water, generators running. Somewhere out in the dark, a person who has not slept in 9 days is standing at a railing, being spoken to gently by someone who died years ago, and every word of it is coming from inside their own head, assembled out of memories they never stopped carrying. They are not being tricked by a monster. They are being tricked by love. That is the machine we are dealing with. It does not break in. It gets invited, because it arrives sounding exactly like the thing you have been praying to hear again. Chapter 3. A Church Built on a Lie. We have followed the object from the crater to the laboratory, and we have watched a man die for telling the truth about it. Now we need to understand how a lie about that death grew into the largest religion in human space, because everything that happens on Aegis VII, on Titan Station, and on a frozen planet at the edge of nowhere runs on the fuel this chapter creates. Unitology grew faster than any religion previously formed on Earth. That is the recorded assessment. And speed is the detail worth interrogating. Movements do not spread that quickly on the strength of their theology. They spread when they arrive at a moment when a large number of people are already carrying something they cannot put down. Look at the century honestly. The environment is failing. Resources are running out. The old political order has collapsed into a single planetary government by necessity rather than by choice. People are being shipped off-world to colonies that are dangerous, isolating, and profitable for somebody else. Add to that the specific texture of an era where death has become industrialized and distant, where families are separated by shock point jumps and years of transit, and where a person can lose someone permanently without ever seeing a body. Into that environment arrives a doctrine with a single, devastating promise. Death is not the end. Every human being will be reborn, together, in everlasting unity, through convergence. I want to be careful here, because it would be lazy and inaccurate to treat unitologists as fools. Research on high-commitment religious groups consistently finds that recruits are not, on average, less intelligent or less educated than the general population. What predicts joining is life circumstance rather than deficiency. Isolation, recent bereavement, geographic dislocation, the loss of an existing social network, the The strongest predictor of conversion in most studies is not the appeal of the belief system at all. It is the presence of a personal relationship with someone already inside. Now overlay that onto the dead space setting and watch how well it fits. A colony worker, 12 years from home, no family within a shock point jump, working a contract for a corporation that regards him as a line item. He is exactly the profile, and the church is not selling him an abstraction. It is selling him the specific thing he lies awake wanting, which is the promise that separation is temporary. There is a second layer, and it is the one that makes the church genuinely sinister as an institution, rather than merely tragic as a belief. Membership costs money. Advancement within the organization requires payment, and the higher tiers of understanding are gated behind it. That structure does something very precise to a person's psychology. Once someone has paid a significant amount into a belief system, the cost of doubting it rises sharply, because doubt now requires admitting the loss. Research into what is often called effort justification found this decades ago in a much smaller setting. People who go through a difficult or costly initiation report liking the group more afterward, not less, and the effect scales with how unpleasant or expensive the entry was. The mind resolves the discomfort by increasing its commitment, since the alternative is accepting that the sacrifice bought nothing. So the church is not simply lying to people. It is building a financial structure that makes disbelief psychologically expensive. And then there is the last piece, the one that turns a religion into a weapon. Unitologists believe that convergence is a good thing, not a threat to be survived, a destination. When the process begins, the faithful are not supposed to run, and the faithful do not run. Hundreds of them take their own lives in a single mass event on Aegis VII, and they do it in a public square, in the open, as an act of participation. Every other horror franchise gives you people trying to escape the monster. This one gives you people opening the door. If you are still with me, this next stretch is where the pattern starts to lock into place, and I want to flag something that becomes very hard to unsee once you have noticed it. There is a version of this story in which the church is the antagonist and the government is the reluctant protector of the public. That version does not hold up for even a chapter, and the reason it does not hold up is uglier than anything the church does. Keep it in the back of your mind while we go through the next 300 years, because it lands in Chapter 6. The men who murdered Altman founded the religion. Let that sit for a second longer. The theology of Unitology was authored at its root by people who had watched the marker at close range and had seen precisely what it did to human bodies. They were not deceived converts. They were the two individuals in the universe least likely to believe the story they were selling. That is the difference between a cult and a laundering operation. Now, does this mean every Unitologist in the timeline is a victim? No. And flattening it that way would lose the most interesting characters in the series. Some of them are true believers who would die for the promise. Some of them are opportunists who use the structure for power. Some are executives who wear the faith like a good suit at a fundraiser. What matters for the investigation is that the institution provides all three types with the same thing, which is permission. There is a real-world observation about ideology that fits the shape of it well. A doctrine's practical function is often not to convince people to do things they would never otherwise do, but to remove the internal cost of doing things they already have reasons to do. Greed does not need a religion to exist. Greed with a religion attached, however, gets to call itself devotion. Watch how it plays out in practice, and hold the image, because you will see it again on a mining colony. A discovery is made. The church wants the object because the object is holy. The corporation wants the object because the object is valuable. The government wants the object because the object is powerful. Three institutions with three incompatible worldviews arrive at the identical decision, which is to move the artifact closer to human population centers rather than further away. Not one of them is behaving irrationally within their own logic. That is what makes it a system failure, rather than a story about bad apples. And the system is about to get its hands on the technical capability it has been missing. For decades after the disaster at Chicxulub, The object sat in the hands of a state that could not reproduce it. Then, in the final years of the 21st century, that changed. The researchers of the sovereign colonies cracked it. They reverse-engineered the black marker and produced copies of their own, and because of the material they were built from, those copies took on a different color and a different name, the red markers. Here is where the story stops being about one artifact in one crater and becomes something closer to an epidemic. A single object, however dangerous, is a containable problem. A blueprint is not. They believed they had solved the resource crisis. They believed they were about to end the wars that the shortage had started. And they had learned exactly enough from Altman's death to know that this work needed to be done quietly, on worlds far away from anyone who might ask a question about it. So they picked 3 planets nobody was watching, put a marker on each of them, and turned them on. Every single one of those sites produced an outbreak. What the sovereign colonies did in response to that result is the thing that reshapes human civilization, and it is not what you would expect from a government that had just been proven catastrophically wrong. They looked at 3 separate atrocities and concluded that the experiment needed to be bigger. Chapter 4: 3 Worlds, 3 Outbreaks. Every long investigation reaches a point where the paperwork stops being boring and starts being evidence. This is that point, 200 years after the disaster at Chicxulub. Researchers working for the sovereign colonies succeeded where everyone before them had failed. They reverse-engineered the black marker. The result was a series of replicas, built from different material, and the color of that material gave them their name, red markers. I want you to notice what those 80 years mean, because a true crime case lives on timelines, and this one has a gap shaped exactly like a motive. 80 years is long enough that nobody working on the replica project had been present at Chicxulub. The people who saw the bodies were dead. The people who conducted the autopsies were dead. What remained was documentation, and documentation is a very poor substitute for a witness, because documentation can be edited, summarized, reclassified, and eventually reduced to a footnote in a briefing. Somewhere in those 8 decades, an event that had killed a research team became a paragraph in a file. And a paragraph in a file is something an ambitious administrator can talk his way around. Add the second pressure. By this era, humanity is losing. The resource crisis has metastasized into open conflict, with a resource war and then a session war tearing at a government that was only ever unified out of desperation in the first place. Colonies are expensive. Ships are expensive. Every marginal unit of energy is a strategic asset. So when the phrase limitless energy resurfaces in a classified proposal, it does not arrive as a scientific curiosity. It arrives as a war-winning weapon, and the people it arrives in front of are not scientists. They are politicians who need something to show. The proposal was approved. The replicas were built, and then came the decision that turns a bad research program into a chargeable offense. They deployed the markers covertly, together with their research teams, to isolated worlds. Consider what isolated means in that sentence, because the word is doing an enormous amount of work. There is a benign reading, which is that a hazardous experiment belongs far away from populated space. That reading collapses the moment you notice there were people on those worlds. A prison colony operated on Aspera. Personnel accompanied every marker. Nobody was sent to an empty rock to run the tests remotely with drones. Isolation here does not describe the absence of risk to human beings. It describes the absence of witnesses. That distinction is the spine of the entire 24th century, and it explains a decision that looks insane from the outside. If your goal is safety, you build in monitoring, oversight, and the ability to call for help. If your goal is deniability, you do the opposite. You strip the site of anyone who could carry the story home, and you make sure the location is one that nobody has any reason to visit. The sovereign colonies chose deniability, which means that on some desk, somewhere, before a single marker was switched on, a person had already answered the question of what would happen if this went wrong. Their answer was that it would go wrong somewhere nobody would find out. Then they activated the markers, and all 3 sites produced necromorph outbreaks. 3 for 3, not a partial failure. not an anomalous result on one world requiring further study. A perfect, unbroken record of catastrophe across 3 separate planetary environments with 3 separate teams. In any honest engineering discipline, 100% failure rate ends a program the same afternoon. Now, I want to slow down on Aspera in particular, because there is a texture to it that gets lost when this era is summarized as a bullet point. The marker there sat near a prison colony. Among the people caught in the events that followed was a man named Istvan Sato, one of 2 brothers whose lives that world destroyed. The reason this matters for the investigation is simple. A prison colony is a population that the state has already classified as expendable. Nobody is coming to check on them. Nobody outside will demand an inquiry. When the record shows that the sites were chosen for isolation, the presence of a carceral population on one of them stops being a coincidence and starts looking like a criterion. Real-world research into how institutions distribute environmental and industrial hazards has documented this pattern for decades. Dangerous facilities cluster where political resistance is weakest. It is not usually the product of anyone sitting down and drafting a policy of cruelty. It emerges from the cold logic of least resistance, applied repeatedly by many separate people making individually defensible choices about where a difficult project should go. The end result is that harm accumulates in the places least able to object, and the paper trail shows nothing but efficiency. Dead Space takes that real-world dynamic and runs it to its final conclusion. The people who died on those 3 worlds were selected by the same logic that puts a refinery on the wrong side of a river. And now the detail that reframes everything. The marker on Aegis VII was left there. The site was shuttered. The planet was blacklisted. And the object was buried and abandoned in place, which is the 24th century equivalent of dropping a live device down a well and pouring concrete over the opening. That artifact stays in the ground for roughly 200 years. It stays there while the government that put it there collapses. It stays there while a new government forms and forgets. It stays there while a mining corporation grows large enough to build ships the size of cities. Every character you will meet in the second half of this story, every crew member of the Ishimura, every colonist on Aegis VII, every person who will die screaming 3 centuries from now, is already condemned at this moment by an administrative decision to leave something dangerous somewhere convenient. That is the crime. It happens here, in a meeting room, with nobody bleeding. There is a particular horror in slow-motion causation, and I think it is the reason this franchise stays with people longer than the jump scares would suggest. The victims and the perpetrators never occupy the same century. There is no confrontation available. No survivor gets to look the responsible party in the eye, because the responsible party has been dust for 200 years and died believing the matter was closed. Which raises a question I want to leave standing for a while. If the sovereign colonies knew enough to blacklist those worlds, what exactly did they think they had contained? The answer is nothing. They contained nothing. Understand what an outbreak actually requires, and the containment strategy falls apart on contact. A marker generates a signal. The signal drives exposed people toward dementia, sleeplessness, hallucination, and violence. Violence produces the dead, and it is the dead that the process needs, because a corpse is the raw material. Burying the object does not neutralize any part of that chain. It only guarantees that the next people to encounter it will do so without any idea what they are looking at. The colonies had not solved the problem. They had scheduled it. And here is where the case takes the turn that makes the rest of this story inevitable, because the researchers noticed something in the data from those 3 failed sites that they should never have been able to see. The red markers were receiving something. Not generating, receiving. Across 3 worlds, separated by unthinkable distances, the replicas were picking up a signal from somewhere else, and the fact that they were picking up the same thing meant the source was a real location with real coordinates. They started calling it the master signal. Now put yourself in the position of the men reading that report. You have just presided over 3 atrocities. Your program has killed everyone it touched. Your government is losing a war and needs a miracle. And the data in front of you says that all of this destruction has been pointing the entire time at a single origin point somewhere out in the dark. Chapter 5. Something is calling them home. Between 2300 and 2314, humanity conducted the largest and best-funded scientific expedition in its history, and it is the single most thoroughly documented disaster in this entire timeline. That documentation is why this chapter can be told with real specificity, and why it feels less like a horror story and more like reading the transcripts of an inquiry that was never allowed to convene. The first step was construction. 3 new markers were built specifically to serve as receivers, and they were installed in an array aboard a facility called Ptolemy Station. The purpose was triangulation. If a signal is coming from a fixed point, 3 separated receivers can cross-reference the direction and produce a location. It worked. The array traced the master signal to a remote frozen planet, and the Sovereign Colony's Armed Forces Galactic Expedition launched to find it. Pay attention to the composition of that expedition, because the seating chart is the whole tragedy in miniature. Command of the naval element belonged to Admiral Marjorie Graves. The scientific effort was spearheaded by Dr. Earl Serrano and the Science Division. The military ground forces were led by Major General Spencer Mahad, who arrived with his own unit and his own priorities. 3 chairs. 3 incompatible definitions of success. That is not a mission structure. That is a fault line. Graves, from what survives of her communications with her crew, understood the expedition as historic. She spoke of the hopes and dreams of a future being at stake, and she was careful to acknowledge that most of the people aboard were not cleared to know what they were actually doing. She was commanding a ship full of people who had been ordered to risk their lives for a purpose they were not permitted to be told. Serrano wanted the answer. He was there for the science, and the science on that ice world was, by any measure, the most important discovery in human history. Mahad wanted to leave. He pressed Graves to abort the mission and take the fleet home so his forces could be used in the Secession War. And when he was told the mission concerned the markers, he was not persuaded of its importance. Graves eventually had Serrano brief him directly on what they were actually chasing. Meanwhile, she was dealing with the practical friction of an unwanted passenger, forced to double bunk half her officers to make room for Mahad's unit, whom she regarded as rude and useless aboard her ship. It is such a small human detail. Bunk assignments, inter-service contempt, 2 senior officers who cannot stand each other, forced into a shared command at the edge of known space, with the fate of the species sitting in a crate in the cargo hold. Now the expedition reaches the planet, and on the 26th of August, 2311, an initial drop zone is established on the surface. They find alien life forms. Serrano's dig teams begin unearthing artifacts and markers from beneath the ice, and then comes the breakthrough that gives this era its name in the record. They recover a specimen, and they call it Rosetta. The name tells you exactly what it meant to them. A Rosetta Stone is the object that makes an unreadable language readable. This specimen produced breakthroughs in understanding both the markers and the aliens themselves, which means that, for the first time in 300 years, human beings were not guessing. They were reading. That should have been the moment everything got better. Instead, it is the moment the expedition begins to die, and the manner of its dying is the most clinically precise sequence in the franchise. Prolonged exposure to the markers begins to affect the dig team personnel. The markers transferred to the flotilla for research begin affecting the crews in orbit. The recorded symptoms are specific and consistent. Dementia, headaches, sleeplessness, hallucinations. I want to spend real time on that symptom list, because it is the most quietly brilliant piece of design in the entire series, and most people slide past it. Look at the order. Sleeplessness comes early. Insomnia is not frightening. Insomnia is normal in a stressful deployment, in a cold environment, on a ship with irregular shifts and bad lighting and no natural day. Every single person on that expedition had 10 perfectly good reasons to be sleeping badly that had nothing to do with an alien artifact. Then comes what sleep deprivation actually does to a human being. And this part is not fiction at all. Research on sustained sleep loss has repeatedly found that extended deprivation produces perceptual disturbances in otherwise healthy people. It begins with misperceptions, drifts towards simple visual hallucinations, and in prolonged cases can progress to full hallucinations and disordered, paranoid thinking. The effects are reliable enough that sleep deprivation has been studied as a model for temporary psychosis in people with no psychiatric history whatsoever. Now stack that on top of a signal that is already inducing hallucination, and consider the diagnostic nightmare it creates for a ship's medical officer. A crewman reports seeing his dead brother in a corridor. The doctor checks the log, sees the man has been on shift rotation in a high-stress environment with poor sleep for weeks, and diagnoses exhaustion, which is correct. It is also completely inadequate, and the inadequacy will kill everyone aboard. That is why the markers are so effective against organized, rational institutions specifically. The early stage of the disaster is indistinguishable from a routine occupational health problem. By the time a symptom appears that cannot be explained away, the symptom is a body. And then it reaches command. Admiral Graves began to succumb. She heard voices, and the significant part is what she believed about them. She understood them as speaking to her alone, meant just for her, which is an extraordinarily precise piece of writing about how this kind of delusion actually presents, not generic voices in a room, a private communication, addressed to her by name, carrying the unmistakable weight of being chosen. Out of that came an obsession. She became fixated on turning off the alien machine on the surface. Mahad had her quarantined to her quarters, and command of the expedition passed to him. Now, here is a genuinely difficult question, and I do not want to resolve it too cleanly, because the material does not. Mahad was right. The commanding admiral was experiencing a deteriorating mental state, and was fixating on an action that would have ended all life in the galaxy. Removing her from command was, on the available evidence, the correct call. A man who had been dismissive, obstructive, and openly contemptuous of the entire mission made the one decision that any competent officer should have made. And he made it for reasons that had almost nothing to do with understanding the threat. That is the uncomfortable engine of this whole section. Being right and being trustworthy are separate things, and this expedition is where the difference gets a body count. Consider how Graves' obsession actually formed, because Serrano eventually worked it out, and the answer recontextualizes her entire arc. Turning off the machine would not shut down the danger. Deactivation would restart the convergence event and complete the dormant Brethren moon hanging above that planet. Her plea to turn it off was the moon's own message, routed through a human being, spoken in the voice of a woman who genuinely believed she was saving everyone. The thing in the sky did not need to break the door down. It needed one exhausted, brilliant, deeply responsible person to become convinced that the safety switch was the murder weapon, and the murder weapon was the safety switch. It got that. It got it by finding the part of her that wanted to protect her crew, and turning it around. That is the true predatory mechanic of the markers, and it took the series 3 games to state it plainly. The signal does not corrupt people by making them evil. It corrupts them by feeding their virtues bad information. The dead wife appears to the grieving husband. The private message arrives for the officer who feels responsible for everyone. The promise of unity is offered to the isolated. Every attack is custom-built out of the target's own decency. Serrano, meanwhile, was doing the work that mattered. He and his research team came to understand the machine, and they understood the truth about what was above them, and once they understood it, they did something that reads as pure desperation. Knowing the order to destroy everything was coming, they took the Rosetta specimen and cut it into pieces so it could be hidden. Think about the state of mind that requires. A scientist takes the single most valuable object his species has ever recovered, the thing that finally let humanity read the language of the universe, and he takes it apart and hides the pieces around a frozen world in the hope that someone, someday, might come looking. He was not preserving the specimen for himself. He was writing a message to a reader who did not exist yet. Serrano also attempted to complete the machine himself. Mahad prevented it. In the course of that, an accident left Serrano unable to walk. So picture the endgame of the greatest expedition in human history. The Admiral is sealed in her quarters, listening to a voice she believes has chosen her. The chief scientist is crippled, hiding the dismembered pieces of an alien body in the ice. The general is in command, has never wanted to be there, and now has in his hands a report that says his mission has found something that can end the species. Somewhere back home, a council reads that report, and what they order is the single largest act of institutional violence in the timeline, carried out not by monsters, but by soldiers on their own people with paperwork. Chapter 6. The Order That Killed Everyone. If you have been listening for the last hour, this is where the case turns, and I want to warn you before we go in, that this chapter is heavy in a way the earlier ones were not. There are no necromorphs in the worst part of what follows. That is exactly why it is the worst part. The Sovereign Colonies Council evaluated the accumulated research from the expedition and the reports from the marker test sites, and they reached a conclusion. Tau Volantis was classified as a Class 5 first contact scenario, which in their terminology meant an extinction-level threat to humanity. Their assessment was accurate. Their response is the crime. The Council's decision was communicated in language worth examining closely. What they had believed would save them from extinction had instead served only to hasten it. Everything about the markers had to be buried forever. All research, all replicas, even the original black marker, all sites shuttered, all involved planets blacklisted, and then the final clause. Everyone involved in the marker program was to be executed. Authorization to carry it out at Tau Volantis was given to Mahad by the General of the Army, Ambrose Caden. The operation had a name, and the name is deliberately, chillingly bureaucratic. Scenario 5. Here is how it was structured on the ground, and the structure is the thing that will keep you awake. 3 tiers of soldiers were assigned to sweep and cleanse duty. The first crew disabled all of the vehicles. The second took a census of every person who had complied with their orders and killed those who had not. The third destroyed all data, all records, and all communication structures on the planet and in orbit. And when each team finished its assigned task, that team was to end its own life. Read the design of that operation as an engineer would, because it was designed by one. It is a self-consuming machine. Each stage removes a capability and then removes itself. Vehicles first, so nobody can leave. Personnel second, so nobody can testify. Records third, so nothing can be reconstructed. And the operators are consumed at each stage so that the final state of the system is a planet with no survivors, no data, no transport, and no signal, surrounded by minds that will still be live 2 centuries later. It is a perfect containment protocol. It contains everything except the thing it was meant to contain, which is still down there, frozen, waiting. Now, this is the place where I have to say something plainly, because the true crime framing risks making it too tidy. There is a defense of Scenario 5. The threat was genuinely extinction level. The Council was not wrong about what they were looking at. If knowledge of the markers survived, someone would eventually rebuild them, and the rebuild would eventually succeed, and the outcome of that success is the end of every living thing. Under that logic, the deaths of a few thousand people to permanently bury the technology is a monstrous arithmetic that still comes out in favor of the order. Real-world ethical debate has argued versions of this for centuries, and the objection to it has always been the same. Once you accept that a sufficiently large future harm justifies present killing, you have handed an unlimited license to whoever gets to estimate the size of the future harm. The estimate is always made in secret. It is always made by the people who caused the problem, and it is always used against the people with the least power in the room. Watch how that plays out here precisely. The council that ordered these executions was the same institution that had authorized the marker program, the same body that chose isolated worlds so there would be no witnesses. Not one member of that council was on the list of people to be executed. The order flowed outward and downward, from the architects to the operators, and the architects went home. Every single person who died under Scenario 5 was someone who had followed instructions. That is what I need you to hold, because it converts this from a tragic necessity into something with a very familiar structure. Institutions facing catastrophic exposure do not typically destroy themselves. They destroy the record and the personnel closest to the record. The bodies pile up at the operational end, and the decision-making end issues a statement about difficult choices. The order was carried out on the 18th of June, 2214. Let me give you the human detail, because the abstraction is unbearable, and the specific is somehow easier to carry. A transport called the Mule had been shot down. Aboard it was the Codex, which held the accumulated understanding of everything the expedition had learned. Serrano, crippled and out of time, asked a private named Tim Kaufman to recover it and bring it to him. Kaufman went. Try to see that from inside, a private, not an officer, not a scientist, not anybody with clearance to know what any of this meant. A young man in a uniform on the coldest world any human being had ever stood on, sent by a scientist he probably barely knew to fetch a piece of equipment out of a crashed transport while the fleet above him was systematically killing itself. He was intercepted by Mahad and executed. Mahad wiped the codex of its data, and having ensured Scenario 5 was complete, he ended his own life. That last act deserves analysis rather than applause, because I think it is the most morally complicated single moment in the Dead Space timeline. Mahad did not exempt himself. Every executioner in the operation, including the man in command of it, was included in the final count. Whatever else he was not a coward hiding behind an order, and he was not a man who arranged a quiet transport home for himself while his subordinates died. He was also, in the earlier records, an officer who dismissed this mission as a distraction, who badgered his admiral to abandon it, who found the entire scientific premise unconvincing, and who wanted his troops back in a war. The man who could not be persuaded that the markers mattered became the man who killed everyone to keep the markers buried. Both of those things are him. People are not consistent, and this franchise is unusually honest about that. Almost everyone died. The record notes one known survivor. Lieutenant Tucker Edwards refused to end his own life. He killed his superior officer in self-defense, and then he sealed himself away in the conning tower of the Terra Nova and rigged it heavily against anyone who came for him. He held out, alone, on a dead ship, above a frozen planet, surrounded by the corpses of his entire service. And eventually he complied anyway, having succumbed to loneliness and isolation, ending his own life at the top of that tower. I find him the most quietly devastating figure in the whole timeline, and here is why. Everyone else on that world was killed by an order. He was killed by the silence that came after it. He did the hardest possible thing. He refused. He survived the refusal. And what defeated him was not the Necromorphs, not the marker signal, not a soldier with a rifle. It was 200 days of nobody answering. The consequences of Scenario 5 did not stay on that planet. The purges were carried out across sovereign colonies' territory, and they were extensive enough to gut the military. The scuttling of vessels was so widespread that outside observers interpreted it as a deliberate scorched earth tactic. Deprived of its forces and its research base, the colonies lost the Secession War in short order and collapsed entirely. What replaced it was an Earth-centric government called the Earth Colonial Alliance. So the true crime accounting of the 24th century looks like this. A government discovers an existential threat, orders the deaths of its own people to hide it, destroys its own warfighting capability in the process, and is dissolved by the war it could no longer fight. Its successor inherits the territory, the population, and the ruins. What its successor does not inherit is the knowledge. That is the detail that makes everything from here on inevitable. And it is the cruelest joke in the series. Scenario 5 worked. The information was genuinely destroyed. The blacklists held. The minds stayed live. 2 centuries pass with the human race in total ignorance of what nearly ended it. But an object was still buried on Aegis VII, and a corporation was about to go looking for minerals. If you are still here, the next stretch is where the story you actually recognize begins. And I would ask you to hold one question in your head as we walk into it. Everything you have heard so far has been institutions failing at enormous scale, with thousands of lives inside the failure. What we are about to look at is one ship, one crew, and one man who takes a routine repair job because he wants to find his girlfriend. The scale collapses, the pattern does not change at all, and somewhere in the middle of that ship, there is a detail about who was really steering events that almost nobody notices on a first playthrough, because it is delivered as an aside by a man everyone assumes has already lost his mind. Chapter 7. 200 Years of Forgetting. Here is the strangest thing about the 2 centuries that follow Scenario 5. Nothing happens. No outbreaks, no markers, no inquiry, no leak, no deathbed confession that reaches a journalist. The most catastrophic secret in the history of the species is buried so thoroughly that the successor government does not appear to know it is sitting on top of it. Humanity spends 200 years building an entire civilization on ground that has already been declared radioactive by people whose names have been erased from the record. For an investigator, a silence that long is its own piece of evidence. It tells you the cover-up worked, and it tells you something worse. Everyone who could have connected the dots died on purpose, so the next generation to encounter a marker will start from zero. Let me describe the world that grows in that silence, because the shape of it decides everything. EarthGov inherits the wreckage of the sovereign colonies. The old military is gutted. The old research base is ash. What remains is a species with a resource crisis it never solved, spread across colonies it can barely supply, governed from a single planet by an administration that has replaced ideology with logistics. Into that vacuum walks the corporation. Planet cracking becomes viable, and the moment it does, the economics of the entire human sphere change. The technique is exactly what the name suggests. A ship anchors itself above a world, tears a section of the crust loose with gravity tethers, hauls that section into orbit, and processes it. Mining stops being a hole in the ground. Mining becomes surgery on a planet. The proving ground is Jupiter's moon, Titan. Humanity harvests it, demonstrates that the method works at scale, and in the year 2446 launches the first of a new class of vessel built specifically for the job, the USG Ishimura. She was the first planet cracker ever built, and one of the first capital ships fitted with a shock point drive, which is the technology that makes practical travel between stars possible. 2 revolutions in one hull. In her era, she was not a haunted house. She was a national achievement, the kind of ship children learn about in school, the flagship of an industry that had just solved a crisis nobody else could solve. That matters enormously for how the horror lands 60 years later, and I want to make sure it does not slide past. When you walk her corridors in the game, you are not exploring an abandoned facility. You are walking through the wreck of the best thing humanity had made. The equivalent would be finding the first airliner, the one in the museum, sitting in a field with everyone still strapped in. Now, the corporation that operated her deserves its own paragraph in the case file, because it is the actual antagonist of the middle act, and it never once raises its voice. The Concordance Extraction Corporation is not a cartoonishly evil organization. That is precisely what makes it work. Nothing in the record shows the CEC as a body that wants people to die. What the record shows is a company that wants throughput, that has quotas, that runs its ships on maintenance schedules stretched slightly past their sensible limits, and that regards employee complaints as an item on an agenda rather than as data about a hazard. Look at the year 2497. A gravity tether failure produced what became known as the Wanat disaster, and the losses were 3 supply ships, 1 planet cracker, and an entire colony gone because a tether failed, and the industry kept cracking planets. That single line is the CEC in full. It is also, precisely, the pattern we watched 200 years earlier at the marker test sites, wearing a corporate uniform instead of a military one. A catastrophic failure occurs. The failure is expensive. The expense is absorbed, and the practice continues because the practice is profitable. The bodies become an accounting line called risk. Research into industrial safety culture has a term for organizations that operate this way, describing them as having drifted into failure. The concept is that complex systems do not usually break because someone was negligent on a Tuesday. They break because, under constant economic pressure, the boundary of acceptable practice creeps outward year after year, always in the direction of cheaper and faster, and each new position feels normal because it is only slightly beyond the last one. The organization is not being reckless, it is being efficient. Right up until efficiency crosses a line nobody was watching. 2 people are born during this stretch, and it is worth marking them. On the 14th of December, 2468, Isaac Clarke is born. On the 21st of April, 2478, John Carver is born. Neither of them is anybody yet. One will become an engineer, the other a soldier, and in both cases the thing that destroys their lives is a decision made by a committee that dissolved before either of their great-grandparents drew breath. Then, in 2505, the CEC does something illegal. They enter the Aegis cluster and begin scanning planets for cracking potential. I want to be exact about the wording, because the record is exact. The entry was illegal. That cluster was off limits, and the company went in anyway. Nobody in that survey team knew why the region was restricted. That knowledge died 2 centuries earlier under Scenario 5. What they knew was that the region was flagged, and that flags on a star chart are usually about jurisdiction, mineral rights, or old territorial disputes rather than about anything that can hurt you. The rule looked like bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is what corporations are built to route around. They scanned Acheron LV 426 and found extremely valuable mineral deposits. Here is the moment. This is the hinge of the entire franchise, and it happens in a survey report. A ship's crew finds a rich world inside a restricted zone, and instead of reporting the anomaly to a regulator, the company proceeds. Construction on a colony begins in preparation for the crack. By 2157, personnel are on the surface getting the site ready. Consider what the blacklist actually was, from the inside. 200 years ago, a government executed thousands of its own people to ensure that particular planet would never be visited again. The blacklist was their tombstone. It was the last instruction left by a civilization that killed itself to deliver it, and it arrived in the 26th century as a line of restricted airspace on a chart, with no explanation attached, easily bypassed by a mining company with good lawyers. That is the cruelest thing about institutional memory. A warning without its reasoning attached has a shelf life, and the shelf life is shorter than a career. I think there is something genuinely profound buried in this, and it is the reason this section of the timeline sticks with me more than the monsters do. The people who died under Scenario 5 believed they were buying permanent safety with their lives. What they actually bought was 200 years, and they had no way of knowing that a warning has to be maintained by living people who understand it, or it becomes noise. Real-world researchers working on the problem of long-term nuclear waste storage have wrestled with exactly this, and have never solved it. The task is to build a message that will still function as a warning 10,000 years from now, for people who will not speak any current language and may not share any current assumptions about symbols. The proposals have included hostile architecture, engineered landscapes, and the deliberate creation of folklore and priesthoods to carry the message forward through generations. The reason such extreme measures get proposed is that everyone involved agrees on one point. Documents fail, signs fail, institutions fail, meaning decays faster than danger does. Scenario 5 was a warning with no message attached. It said, "Stay away," and burned the reason. So a company sends colonists to the exact planet where a 2-century-old device is waiting in the ground, and those colonists arrive with a full safety briefing about tether stress and vacuum exposure and nothing at all about the object beneath their feet. They begin excavating, and roughly 5 weeks before the events everyone recognizes, somebody's scanner registers something down there that is not a mineral. Chapter 8. The Colony That Reported Everything. 5 weeks before the events of the first game, CEC personnel rediscovered the object on Aegis VII, the artifact designated Marker 3B. Note the word rediscovered. It was found on the surface, on a pedestal, precisely where it had been left, not hidden, not sealed in a vault. Sitting there for 2 centuries in the open, waiting for the next intelligent species to come and take an interest. Word of its existence traveled fast, and the direction it traveled is the most incriminating detail in this chapter. It reached the leadership of the CEC, and it reached the Church of Unitology. Consider what that means about the state of human civilization in 2508. An engineering crew finds an unidentified alien artifact on a restricted world. That information does not go to a scientific body. It does not go to a government regulator. It does not go to anyone with a mandate to protect the public. It goes up a corporate ladder and sideways into a religious organization, and those 2 institutions between them decide what happens next. The church wanted it because it was a holy relic. The corporation wanted it because the church wanted it, and because the church had money and influence inside the company. The people on the surface wanted to go home. Only one of those 3 groups is asked their opinion, and it is not the one standing next to the thing. Then the symptoms start, and this is where I want to go slowly, because the sequence is documented with something close to clinical precision, and it is a masterclass in how a disaster gets misfiled. Stage 1. Insomnia cases increase drastically among colony personnel. Not violence, not visions, sleep loss. A workforce on a hostile planet, working long shifts under artificial light, in an environment with no natural day and no way home, starts having trouble sleeping. Put yourself in the position of the colony's management for a moment, honestly, without the benefit of knowing the ending. You receive a report that insomnia complaints are up. What is the most probable explanation? Overwork, poor rotation planning, stress about the upcoming crack, bad ventilation, homesickness. Every one of those is real. Every one is common in remote industrial sites, and everyone has a cheap fix that does not involve halting a multi-billion credit operation. The correct explanation is not on the list of plausible explanations, and it could not have been, because the information that would have put it there was destroyed 2 centuries earlier by people who thought they were saving the world. Stage 2. 4 weeks out, the colony experiences increasing cases of insomnia and dementia. Dementia is a much louder signal than insomnia. Cognitive deterioration in a young, screened, physically fit workforce is not an occupational health footnote. It is an alarm. And here is the line in the record that should be read aloud at any inquiry. Colony management refused to take the increasing violence seriously. Even as the first insomnia-related homicide occurred, someone died. A person on that colony killed another person, and the connection to the sleeplessness was clear enough that the record links them directly, and management's response was to not take it seriously. I want to dismantle that response carefully, because the easy reading is that these were bad men, and the easy reading makes the story less useful than it should be. Think about what taking it seriously would have required: halting the excavation, suspending planet crack preparations, filing a report that would have revealed the operation was inside a restricted cluster, explaining to corporate leadership why the schedule had slipped on a project already contingent on an illegal entry with an artifact aboard that the church was actively interested in acquiring. Every incentive in the structure pointed one direction. The cost of raising the alarm was immediate, personal, and career-ending. The cost of not raising it was diffused, future, and shared by everyone. Research on organizational silence describes exactly this. Employees, including managers, routinely withhold concerns not because they fail to notice problems, but because the perceived cost of speaking is high, and the perceived chance of anything changing is low. The behavior is not stupidity, it is a rational read of a system that punishes messengers, which is how a homicide becomes a personnel matter. Stage 3. 1 to 2 weeks out, the marker is extracted from its pedestal and brought inside the colony. Read that in sequence with what came before. The insomnia is rising, the dementia is spreading, a person has already been killed, and the operational decision taken at that moment is to bring the object closer to where everyone sleeps. Nothing in the record explains the reasoning for moving it inside at that specific point, and I am not going to construct a motive for you. What the record establishes is the order of events, and the order is damning enough on its own. Then comes the event that should have ended everything. 50 Unitologists take their own lives in a single incident that becomes known as the Union Square mass suicide. 50 people in a public square on a colony with a limited population. Now, everything I said earlier about the church pays off here, and I want to connect it explicitly. To an outside observer, this looks like the ultimate proof of danger. To a Unitologist, it looks like something entirely different, because the doctrine holds that convergence is the promised reunion and that death is a doorway. The presence of a marker, to a believer, is not evidence of hazard. It is evidence that the promise is real and that the moment has arrived. 50 people did not die because the marker overwhelmed them. 50 people died because a belief system had spent 3 centuries preparing them to interpret this exact signal as an invitation. And that is the thing about the church that makes it more dangerous than any corporation in the series. The CEC merely fails to recognize a threat. Unitology converts the threat into a sacrament, so that its adherents will walk toward it with their hands open. The violence escalates from there. Several colony personnel and members of the extraction team are killed by an engineer experiencing extreme hallucinations, a man named Sam Caldwell. I want to hold on him for a moment, because he is the first real casualty of this era whose name we have, and he is a warning about how the rest of the story should be read. He was an engineer, same profession as Isaac Clarke, same category of person, doing the same category of work, on the same category of contract. What separates him from the protagonist is not character, or willpower, or moral fiber. It is exposure and timing. The franchise never lets you forget this. Every hostile thing you meet aboard the Ishimura used to be a colleague, not an alien species that invaded from outside. Co-workers, people with lockers and shift patterns and unfinished messages to their families, converted into obstacles. Less than a week out, the Ishimura arrives above Aegis VII. The marker is taken aboard immediately, not after an assessment, not after a quarantine period. The ship arrives and the object goes into the cargo bay. And the reason it happens that fast is sitting in the captain's chair. Benjamin Mathias was a devoted Unitologist, and the church used its influence within the corporation to place him aboard the Ishimura for that ship's final cycle of duty, specifically so that he would be the man who retrieved the artifact. Understand the size of that claim. The captain of the most prestigious vessel in the human fleet was in that chair because a religious organization arranged it in order to secure an alien object for religious purposes, using a mining corporation as the delivery mechanism. The mission everyone else aboard believed they were on was a cover, and this was not invisible to the crew. The first officer, a man named Hanford White, had been a military pilot on Earth during the resource wars before joining the company. He noticed his assessment was that too many senior officers were church-aligned for it to be coincidence, and he described the situation as a stacked deck. He was right, and being right did nothing for him at all. Mathias issued a no-fly order, denying travel between the ship and the colony below. What did move upward were the marker, all related data, and the corpses from the wave of violence. Sit with that inventory for a second. The bodies were brought aboard. Nothing in the record states that Mathias understood what corpses meant in proximity to a marker. What the record establishes is that a ship carrying thousands of people took aboard an active artifact and a supply of the exact raw material the process requires, sealed its own crew off from the surface, and then began mining operations on schedule. Chief Science Officer Terrence Kine began studying the object in the cargo bay, and throughout the vessel, personnel started reporting insomnia, depression, and dementia. The same sequence, same order, same misfiling, on a planet, in a colony, and now on the flagship, in a closed environment, with no escape and no help within days of travel. The pattern has now run across multiple sites and centuries. Tau Volantis, the colony, And now the Ishimura. Nobody involved has ever been told that it is a pattern. 2 days before the arrival of a small repair vessel called the Kellyan, the Ishimura begins the planet crack. Chapter 9. 48 Hours. The last 2 days of the USG Ishimura are the best documented mass casualty event in the franchise, and I want to walk them as an incident timeline rather than as a horror sequence, because the horror is worse when it is ordered. The crack begins. A section of Aegis VII is torn loose and hauled toward the ship, which is standard procedure, the thing this vessel was built to do, the thing her crew had done many times before. Then communications between the ship and the colony are jammed by significant interference. The colony, cut off, comes under attack. The Necromorphs originate from the dead colonists, which is the sentence that turns everything that came before into evidence. The people killed during the weeks of violence become the mechanism by which everyone else is killed. Management's decision not to take the homicide seriously did not merely fail to prevent deaths, it stocked the shelves. The colony's evacuation collapses in a way that is almost too bleak to be believed. There were 6 emergency shuttles on the ground. 5 of them were destroyed in the Shuttleport disaster, along with numerous colonists. 1 shuttle remained. 1 route off a planet that was in the process of eating everyone on it. That final shuttle attempted to reach the Ishimura, and the Ishimura destroyed it. Almost all CEC personnel on Aegis VII are killed. Now, up on the ship, the crew is still operating under the assumption that they have a communications problem and a personnel problem, and the person fighting hardest against that assumption is the head of security. Alyssa Vincent had opposed bringing the artifact aboard in the first place, pointing to the violent incidents that seemed to follow it wherever it went. When the massacre on the surface began, she repeatedly demanded that a squad be sent down to investigate. Matthias denied her, every time, holding to the position that nothing was amiss. There is a version of this story where Vincent is simply the competent officer ignored by a fool. That version is too flattering to everyone involved. Matthias was not confused about what was happening. He was a devout Unitologist executing a mission for his church, and an investigation was the one thing his mission could not survive. His refusal was not blindness, it was a defense of the operation. The situation broke into the open when a vessel piloted by a man named Colin Barrow crashed into the ship's hangar, cutting communication as he came in. Vincent's team was dispatched. They found the shuttle drenched in blood, with no bodies anywhere, and followed a trail away from the wreck. It led them to the morgue. That is where the crew of the Ishimura met the first reanimated dead. The morgue. Of all the rooms on that ship, the one place designed to hold the deceased safely and respectfully, the room whose entire function is the orderly management of death. From there, the ship comes apart. Vincent fights through it and loses officer after officer, and the record notes that she was responsible for saving a fair number of civilians in the process. The most heavily contested areas became engineering and medical, which makes brutal sense. Those decks kept the ship alive and held the highest concentration of people. Then the command structure destroys itself. Captain Matthias dies during a botched attempt to restrain him, in a struggle involving Kine and a sedative. His death is not an assassination and not an execution. It is a scuffle that goes wrong, which is somehow more upsetting than a murder would have been. White immediately moved to arrest Kine, who evaded him. Control of the ship passed to White, who then found he could not re-establish contact with the rest of the vessel, and who progressively lost hope. By the time Vincent reached the bridge, he had concluded the entire ship was lost. Meanwhile, Kine, the chief science officer, the man who had spent the most time in the presence of the artifact, began acting on a plan of his own. The escape pods were jettisoned after the captain's death, empty, launched with nobody aboard. Everyone remaining was now trapped, and Kine disengaged the ship's engines, deliberately, to prevent the Ishimura from carrying the marker back to Earth. That decision sent the vessel into a slow descent toward Aegis VII. Look at what he was actually trying to do, because he is the closest thing this section has to a moral hero, and it does him no favors. Kine understood the threat well enough to conclude that the artifact must never reach human space. He knew who was waiting for it. He knew the ship was already lost. So he attempted to destroy the ship, the object, and himself in a single act, which is Scenario 5 reasoning arrived at independently by one man in a laboratory 200 years later. The same conclusion, reached again by someone with no access to the earlier case. That is the most quietly horrifying thing in this entire chapter. The response is not learned, it is derived. Any sufficiently informed person, given enough time near a marker, arrives at the same answer, which is that everything and everyone in the vicinity has to be erased. Kyne stopped him. He stopped him for a completely defensible reason, which is that the ship was still full of living people, and Kyne was proposing to kill all of them. His refusal to restore the engines meant the vessel stayed in a decaying orbit, and Kyne escaped with her weapon. Two people, both correct, working directly against each other, in a corridor, while the ship dies around them. Cornered at last in the docking bay, Vincent discovered something that mattered. The creatures could not come near the artifact itself. The marker held a zone around it that they would not enter, which is a detail that will become critically important later, and which nobody at the time had the context to understand. Sheltering in that dead space, she recorded a message. She described what had happened, and she stated clearly that both the marker and the Ishimura had to be destroyed. She uploaded it to a distress beacon, opened the airlock, and launched the beacon from the downed shuttle. The decompression took her and the creatures around her out into vacuum. Her body drifts. And this is the part that I think is the single cruelest turn in the first game's backstory, so let me state it plainly. She was manipulated into doing it. The record indicates the marker used a hallucination of one of her own team members, someone she had lost, urging her to save the ship. The artifact does not need to break a person to use them. It found the most determined, most protective, most professionally responsible officer on that vessel, and pointed her devotion at a beacon. Her warning was real. Her message was accurate. Every word of it was true, and the effect of sending it was to draw more people to Aegis VII. That is the design. The distress call is the lure. A signal goes out saying stay away, and the shape of a signal saying stay away is identical to the shape of a signal saying come here, because somebody always has to come and check. The last woman standing on the Ishimura died, believing she had done the only useful thing left, and what she actually did was send an invitation, which brings a small ship into the system. The USG Kellyan arrives at Aegis VII in search of the Ishimura, carrying a repair crew, a security detail, a computer technologist, and an engineer who volunteered for the assignment for reasons that have nothing to do with the job. He has watched a message from his girlfriend. She is aboard that ship. She is a senior medical officer, and the last thing she sent him was strange in a way he cannot explain. He has no idea that she is already the most important thing the marker has found. Chapter 10. 5 People and a Job. A small ship crosses into the Aegis system carrying 5 people and a work order. The USG Kellyan is a maintenance vessel, and the assignment is unglamorous. A capital ship has gone quiet. Communications have failed. Somebody has to go out, dock, restore the systems, and file a report. Aboard are Zach Hammond, the senior security officer running the mission, 2 security personnel including Corporals Johnston and Chen, a computer technologist named Kendra Daniels, and a ship systems specialist named Isaac Clark. This is the part of the story where the horror franchise you know actually begins, and I want to point at the most important thing in the setup before the blood starts, because it is easy to miss. Nobody on that shuttle is a soldier on a mission. They are contractors on a call-out. Isaac is an engineer. His specialty is making broken systems work again. He has no combat training in his file, no tactical background, no reason to expect anything worse than a hard week of repairs in a cold ship. What he carries instead is a video message from his girlfriend that he has watched more times than is healthy. Nicole Brennan is a senior medical officer assigned to the Ishimura. Her message is strange in a way he cannot quite name, and the strangeness is the reason he volunteered for this particular job. Sit with the mundanity of that motive for a second, because it is the emotional engine of 3 games. He did not come to save humanity. He came because someone he loves sent him a message that felt wrong, and then stopped answering. The docking goes badly. A malfunction crashes the Kellion into the Ishimura's landing bay, and the ship's quarantine is broken in the process. Understand the mechanics of that. The Ishimura was sealed, whatever protocol had held, and the rescue party breaks the containment in the act of arriving, which is a note this series will hit again and again. Every attempt to help this situation makes it worse, and it makes it worse specifically because helping requires opening things. They step out into the flight deck. It is quiet, systems are down, and then the crew of the Kellion learns what the Ishimura has become. Johnston and Chen are killed almost immediately. Hammond and Kendra flee, shouting at Isaac to run, and he does the only thing an unarmed engineer can do, which is sprint down a hallway with nothing in his hands. That opening sequence deserves credit for being one of the most honest character introductions in the medium. The protagonist's first action is not a heroic stand. It is undignified, breathless flight from something he does not understand. He finds a tool, not a rifle, a plasma cutter, an industrial mining implement designed to slice rock, and the fact that this becomes his primary weapon is the entire thesis of the character rendered as a gameplay mechanic. Isaac Clarke survives by repurposing the equipment of his trade. Every advantage he gets in this story comes from the fact that he understands machinery. The horror is fought with a maintenance kit. 3 survivors regroup, and the immediate problem is not the creatures. Hammond realizes that ship systems are failing across the board, including the anti-asteroid defenses, with a debris field nearby that will tear the vessel apart if nothing is done. So the mission changes from rescue to repair, and Isaac is sent out into the ship, alone, to fix things. This is the structural genius of the first game as a piece of horror storytelling, and it is worth naming explicitly. The protagonist is not hunting anything. He is doing his job: restore the tram, repair the centrifuge, reroute the power. He walks through an abattoir with a checklist, and the reason he keeps walking into rooms full of dead colleagues is that a system in that room needs attention. Meanwhile, Hammond, decent and out of his depth, promises to help him find Nicole. Kendra does not. Hold on to that, because it is the earliest evidence in the case against her, and it is entirely behavioral. She never engages with the search for Nicole, not once with any warmth. She takes the request, routes around it, and stays useful in ways that keep Isaac moving where she wants him. Now the 3 of them start to come apart, and the record is specific about how. All 3 survivors begin experiencing escalating symptoms of psychosis and delirium, ranging from hallucinations to paranoia. All 3. This is not the protagonist being uniquely sensitive. Everyone in that environment is being affected, at different rates, in different ways. Kendra later mentions having seen her brother aboard, and she describes the experience as impossible. There it is again. The same attack pattern that killed a research team on Aegis VII and broke an admiral at Tau Volantis. The signal reaches into a person, finds a name that still hurts, and wears it. And through all of this, Isaac keeps finding logs. I want to spend a moment on this because the audio log is the most overused device in horror games, and Dead Space does something specific with it that most imitators never understood. What Isaac uncovers is not a monster's origin story. It is an administrative history, meeting records, medical concerns, orders overruled, officers arguing about whether an artifact should have been brought aboard, a security chief demanding an investigation and being denied, the complete paper trail of a preventable disaster, scattered through the rooms where the people who wrote it died. He is not exploring a haunted ship. He is walking through the discovery phase of a lawsuit that will never be filed, and piece by piece it assembles into a picture. The mining operation was illegal, conducted on a world designated off-limits, and its actual purpose was to recover a marker for the Church of Unitology. The cover story was mining. The mission was retrieval. The crew of the Ishimura died as unwitting participants in a religious operation their employer had been paid to enable, and the majority of them never knew there was anything aboard beyond ore. Then a new element enters, and it is the most illuminating thing that happens in the middle of this game. Another ship arrives. The USM Valor, a military vessel. Rescue, surely. Reinforcements. A functioning warship with trained personnel appearing over the worst place in the galaxy. The Valor is infected. An escape pod from the Ishimura, one of those pods launched empty during the initial collapse, reaches the warship carrying a necromorph aboard, and the military vessel falls exactly the way the mining vessel did. But the important part is not the infection. The important part is why she was there. Records show the Valor was dispatched to remove all traces of the Ishimura's presence, not to rescue anyone, not to investigate, to sanitize the site. That is the moment the case against the government closes, and I want to draw the line back explicitly, because this is the payoff of everything in Chapter 6. 200 years earlier, the sovereign colonies executed everyone connected to the marker program to bury the evidence. Their successor state, which supposedly knew nothing, sends a warship to erase the evidence of an illegal mining operation over a blacklisted world where one of those same markers had been left. EarthGov knew, not everything, and not with the depth the old council had. What they knew was enough. They knew there was a marker on Aegis VII. They knew it had been left there as part of an experiment, and they wanted it back. The institutional reflex survived the institution. The state that inherited the wreckage of the sovereign colonies did not inherit their knowledge, but it inherited their instincts perfectly. Contain, deny, retrieve, and send a ship to tidy up afterward. Two governments, 2 centuries apart, arriving at identical behavior in response to the same object. That is not a coincidence of writing. That is the argument the series is making about institutions in general, and it is about to get considerably worse than a warship. Then Kine resurfaces. The chief science officer of the Ishimura is still alive, still aboard, and still holding the conclusion he arrived at in his laboratory. He contacts Isaac and urges him to return the marker to the planet. He is described as deranged, and he is. He has been in that environment far longer than anyone else, but his plan is coherent, it is achievable, and it is very nearly the correct one. And the tragedy of Terrence Kine is that by the time he is right about everything, he no longer sounds like a man anybody should listen to. Kendra shoots him, and then she tells Isaac who she really is. She was never an engineer assigned to a repair crew by chance. Her file was barren when Hammond ran background checks on the team, and the barrenness got shrugged off in the chaos. She had been inserted into the mission on the persistent recommendation of a higher-up in the corporation, and her actual employer was the government. Her task was to retrieve Marker 3A and bring it back to Earth. She had known what this mission was from the moment she boarded. Look at the structure of it. Isaac was recruited by Grief. Hammond was assigned by his employer. Dawson and Chen were following orders. And one member of that 5-person crew knew the whole time that they were being sent into an active outbreak site, and said nothing, because saying something would have compromised the retrieval. The 3 men who died in the first 10 minutes on that flight deck died because a woman standing beside them had a different mission statement. Now, the remake complicates her considerably, and I think the complication makes her better rather than softer. In that version, having seen what the artifact actually does, she works against her own employers, attempting to put the thing beyond their reach entirely. She tells Isaac the truth about Nicole for his own sake. She reaches out to him at the end. Both versions land in the same place. Kendra Daniels understood the political reality of what was happening long before anyone else, and understanding it did not save her, because she was also carrying something Isaac was not ready to hear, and it had nothing to do with governments. Chapter 11. The Woman Who Was Never There. This chapter is about the single cruelest narrative device in modern horror, and I want to handle it carefully, because a lot of people summarize it wrong. Nicole Brennan was a senior medical officer aboard the USG Ishimura. Her partner was an engineer named Isaac Clarke. Before the outbreak reached its worst, she sent him a message, and the message was strange enough that it pulled him across the system to find her. During the collapse of the ship, Nicole took her own life. She was already gone before the Kellyan ever entered the system. Everything Isaac experiences of her aboard that ship, every appearance, every piece of guidance, Every moment of relief at seeing her face happens after her death and inside his own head. I want to work through why this device is more than a twist, because used carelessly it would be cheap, and here it is doing something genuinely rigorous. First, the mechanical layer. Isaac's hallucinations are consistent with everything documented about marker exposure across 3 centuries. The visions come wearing the faces of the dead. They are personal. They arrive with the emotional authority of someone the victim loved. What happened to the researchers at Chicxulub, to Admiral Graves in her quarters, to Alyssa Vincent in the docking bay, happens to Isaac Clarke, and it happens for the same reason and by the same method. Second, the psychological layer, and here the writing is startlingly accurate to the real thing. Research into bereavement has documented for decades that experiences of the deceased are common among grieving people. Studies of widows and widowers have found that a large proportion report sensing, hearing, or seeing their late spouse, and these experiences occur in people with no psychiatric illness of any kind. Most who report them describe the experience as comforting. In many cases, they do not tell anyone out of fear of being thought unwell. Grief hallucinations are not a symptom of madness. They are, for an enormous number of ordinary people, part of what mourning actually looks like. Now put a marker in the room. That is what makes the device so effective. The artifact does not have to manufacture an unfamiliar experience. It has to amplify something the human mind already does on its own. The visions of Nicole would have had a foothold in Isaac's head, with or without an alien signal, because he was a man who had lost someone and had not yet processed it. The marker simply took a normal grief response and turned it into a steering wheel. Third, and this is the part one find genuinely upsetting on repeat playthroughs, the visions of Nicole help him. She guides him. She encourages him. She appears at points where he is close to failing and gives him a reason to keep moving. At a critical moment, working with what he believes is her, he sabotages Kendra's escape and recalls the shuttle. Every useful thing she does is in service of getting the marker where the marker wants to be. So consider what actually happened to this man. His grief was harvested, not exploited in some abstract sense, operationally harvested, converted into fuel, and used to move a 200-year-old object across a dying ship by a process that has no interest in him whatsoever. And when Kendra finally tells him the truth, standing on the colony surface, she does not tell him gently. She tells him Nicole has been dead the entire time, and that he has gone insane like everyone else. Watch what that does to the arc of the whole trilogy. It is not just a shock ending. It retroactively poisons every moment of relief he has had for the past several days. Every time he saw her and felt better was a lie. Every time he trusted a decision because she was there was a decision made by something else. There is a reason the second game opens with him in a psychiatric ward. Now, let me push against the easy reading of Nicole, because reducing her to a hallucination erases the actual woman, and the actual woman matters. Nicole Brennan was a doctor on a ship where the medical deck became one of the 2 most heavily contested areas in the outbreak, precisely because it was essential and crowded. She was there for that. She stayed at her post through a catastrophe that killed her entire profession aboard that vessel, treating people who were becoming untreatable, in a facility that was steadily filling with the thing that comes after death. She did that until it was clear there was no version of the situation that ended with her surviving, and then she made a decision about her own ending in a place where the alternative was becoming raw material. That is not a plot device. That is a professional in an impossible position, and the game respects it enough not to dramatize it. So the emotional core of Dead Space is a man being led around a ship by an imitation of a woman who was, in life, considerably braver than the imitation ever needed to be. The ending sequence follows. Isaac returns the marker to Aegis VII, to its pedestal, and this begins to neutralize the Necromorphs. Vincent's discovery in the docking bay pays off here. The creatures cannot approach the artifact. Restore the object to its place, and the process is interrupted, which is a detail I want to flag hard because it will matter enormously in the final chapters of this story. The markers hold the Necromorphs back. The thing that starts the outbreak is also the thing that contains it. That relationship makes no sense at all if the markers are simply weapons, and it makes perfect sense once you understand what they actually are, which is not something anyone in this story will figure out for another 6 years. Kendra retrieves the marker anyway. Whatever her version of the motive, she takes it, and she is about to leave with it. And the planet answers. The hive mind rises out of Aegis VII, an enormous creature at the center of the outbreak, and it kills her. There is no dignity in it, and no last words. A person is simply removed from the story by something that does not regard her as a person. Isaac attempts to save her. That detail is worth holding on to for the rest of the series. After the betrayal, after the abandonment, after she stranded him on a dying ship and told him the woman he loved had been dead for weeks, his instinct in the final seconds is to try to pull her out of the way. He fights the hive mind and survives. Aegis VII is destroyed, taking the marker with it, and he leaves aboard Kendra's shuttle, alone, aboard a small vessel, in a system where every other living person is dead, with a ship's worth of new information about what his species has been doing, and no one left to tell. And then the woman he loves sits down beside him. Chapter 12. What the company recovered. If you have made it this far, the next stretch is where the story stops being about a haunted ship and starts being about what powerful organizations do with a haunted ship. Everything from here forward is cleanup, and the cleanup is more frightening than the outbreak. Months after the events on Aegis VII, the salvage begins. Another crew reaches the wreckage of the region in the events chronicled as aftermath. What they walk into is a debris field where a planet used to be, and their experience follows the pattern you can now recite from memory. Exposure, symptoms, violence, survivors. Those survivors are recovered by EarthGov, and what happens to them next is the part that matters for this investigation. They are subjected to interrogation and to experimentation. The recovered material is not treated as evidence of a disaster to be prevented. It is treated as an asset, and the fragments recovered are used to jumpstart a new marker project. A government sent a warship to erase all traces of the Ishimura's presence. That warship was lost. A planet was destroyed. Every person connected to the incident is dead except a handful of traumatized survivors. And the institutional response is to collect the pieces, question the witnesses, and start building. Roughly 3 years after the events of the first game, Isaac Clarke is found aboard an executive shuttle. Found, not rescued. The distinction is everything, and it takes the entire second game to unpack. 1 month after the Ishimura went dark, a crew of scavengers, known as the Magpies, discovers the derelict ship, which is where the events of salvage take place. And after that, EarthGov recovers the Ishimura. The government takes the ship. They do not scuttle it. They do not drop it into a star. They tow the largest crime scene in human history back into their own space, and they keep it, because there is value in it. Now, let me lay out the accounting of this era plainly, because a true crime case eventually has to produce a ledger. An entire mining colony on Aegis VII effectively wiped out. The crew of the USG Ishimura, a vessel with a complement in the thousands, effectively wiped out. The crew of the USM Valor, a military warship, lost. The crew of the USG Kellyan lost with a single survivor. The planet Aegis VII itself destroyed. And the outcome at the institutional level is a new research program. There is a concept in the study of organizational learning that fits this exactly, and it is worth naming because it explains why this cycle never breaks. Organizations frequently exhibit what has been described as superstitious learning. They draw the wrong lesson from an outcome, because the lesson they draw is the one compatible with continuing what they were already doing. A failure is analyzed and reframed as a problem of execution rather than of premise. Nothing about the goal is questioned. What gets revised is the procedure. EarthGov did not look at Aegis VII and conclude that markers must never be studied again. They looked at Aegis VII and concluded that markers must be studied under better conditions with tighter security, in a facility they controlled. That is the same conclusion the sovereign colonies reached after Aspera Kremar, and Aegis VII. It is the same conclusion the aliens of Tau Volantis reached millions of years ago when they decided one black marker was insufficient and started building copies. 4 civilizations, or 4 governments, or 4 committees, staring at identical evidence and arriving at identical decisions. That repetition is not lazy writing. That is the point being made. The marker does not need to be intelligent in any way we would recognize, because it does not need to persuade anybody. It only needs to be valuable, and to be encountered by a species that is desperate. The rest happens on its own, driven entirely by ordinary institutional behavior. I said earlier that there is a version of this story where the church is the villain, and the government is the reluctant protector of public safety, and that the version does not hold. Here is where it collapses completely. The church wants convergence because the church believes convergence is salvation. That is a coherent, terrible, sincere position, and a unitologist walking into an outbreak with his arms open is at least acting consistently with what he believes. EarthGov does not believe any of that. EarthGov has the corpses, the medical records, the interrogation transcripts, and the wreckage of 2 ships. They have every reason to know exactly what these objects do. They build one anyway because the promise of limitless energy is worth the risk, and because whoever controls it controls everything. Between fanaticism and calculation, calculation kills more people in this timeline, every time. Meanwhile, one man is in custody. Isaac Clarke was found on a shuttle, and what happened to him next is a 3-year gap in the record that he himself cannot fill. He does not remember it. He wakes up at the start of the second game in a straitjacket, in a psychiatric facility, on a station he has never seen, with no memory of how he got there or how long he has been there. 3 years. Consider what that means about the man who walks out of Aegis VII. He is the only human being alive who has been through a full marker event and survived it. He is the only person who has seen the artifact, the outbreak, the hive mind, and the government's cleanup operation, all with his own eyes. He is not a survivor to be debriefed. He is a specimen with a unique dataset in his head. The thing that makes this the darkest turn in the trilogy is that the marker put it there. His exposure did not simply damage him. It wrote something into him, the way it wrote something into every person who spent time in its presence. And unlike the others, he lived. Which means the most valuable object EarthGov recovered from the entire Aegis VII disaster was not the fragments, and it was not the ship. It was a man. And somewhere on a station built into the remnants of Saturn's largest moon, in a facility built for exactly this purpose, a director with an unremarkable name and a very ordinary manner has been waiting 3 years for that man to be useful. Chapter 13. The 3 Missing Years. Every long case has a section where the file goes quiet, and the quiet part is usually where the worst of it happened. Isaac Clarke was recovered from an executive shuttle roughly 3 weeks after Aegis VII. He surfaces again in the year 2511, on Titan Station, strapped into a straitjacket in a psychiatric ward, with no memory of anything in between. 3 years missing. Let me describe where he was, because the location is a piece of evidence in itself. Titan Station, known informally as the Sprawl, was an EarthGov station built into and around the last remaining fragment of Saturn's moon, Titan, the same Titan that humanity harvested in the 26th century to prove that planet cracking worked. The moon that made the industry possible was consumed by the industry, and what was left of it became the foundation for a city in space. Sit with the image of that. Millions of people living on the leftovers of the first thing they ever tore apart. And within that station, a designation that tells you everything about what it really was. Site 12. A number that implies 11 others. Nothing in the record spells out the full network for us, and I am not going to invent one. What the numbering establishes on its own is that the facility where Isaac was held was one node in a program, and that the program was large enough to require an index. What happened at that site is documented, and it is the most direct act of violence any institution commits against an individual in this entire timeline. Over the 3 years following his recovery, Director Hans Tiedemann and his lead scientists committed Isaac and another man, Nolan Strauss, to the medical center. From their brains, the blueprints and codes of the marker were extracted. Using that information, both men were used to construct a monumental new marker so that the director could obtain its power. The mechanism is the part that turns this from imprisonment into something without a clean name. The marker maps itself into a person's mind. That is why the exposed survivors mattered. Not as witnesses, as storage. Anyone who spends sufficient time near one of these objects has its structure written into them. And if you can read that writing, you no longer need the original artifact at all. You need a person who stood near one and lived. So the new markers were reverse engineered from the mental maps in the heads of the men who survived. Understand precisely what was done to Isaac Clarke here. He was not experimented on to learn about the Necromorphs. He was not interrogated to prevent another disaster. His mind was mined. The same verb his employer used for planets was applied to the inside of his skull by a government in a hospital over 3 years while he was medicated and restrained and unable to remember any of it. The last surviving witness to the worst industrial disaster in human history was converted into a blueprint. And this is where the true crime framing stops being a stylistic choice and becomes the only honest way to describe it. What happened at Site 12 is not a horror scenario. It is a category of crime with a long, documented, real-world history, which is the use of institutionalized people as research material because they cannot refuse, cannot leave, and cannot be believed if they complain. Research ethics as a field exists almost entirely because of this pattern. Historically, the populations most often used in non-consensual medical research were prisoners, the poor, orphans, the colonized, and psychiatric patients. The common thread was never scientific suitability, it was powerlessness combined with a plausible reason to disregard their testimony. A psychiatric patient is the ideal subject for an institution acting in bad faith, because the institution has already certified in writing that nothing the subject says can be trusted. Dead Space understood this well enough to build its entire second act on it. Isaac wakes up in a straitjacket and immediately begins seeing things that are not there, and the terrible efficiency of his situation is that the people who put him in that room can point at the hallucinations as justification for the room. Now consider his fellow patient, because Nolan Strauss is the mirror image and he is genuinely hard to sit with. Strauss had suffered dementia from exposure to marker fragments in the events that followed Aegis VII. Fallen into complete insanity, he killed his wife and his son. He was captured and transported to the Sprawl, where he underwent the same treatment Isaac did under the director's psychiatric team. There is no comfortable place to put him. He is a man who destroyed his own family. He is also a victim of exposure to an artifact that a government left lying around and then salvaged. Both statements are entirely true, and the story refuses to let you pick one. That refusal is the most mature thing in the franchise. Everyone in these games who does something monstrous under marker influence had a life before it, and the presence of an external cause does not undo the loss of the people they killed. The wife and son of Nolan Strauss are just as dead as they would be if he had done it in a clear mind. Explanation is not absolution, and the series never once pretends otherwise. Meanwhile, the man who ran this program has to be understood properly, because reducing him to a villain loses the actual argument. Hans Tiedemann was the director of Titan Station, the highest civil authority aboard the Sprawl. He is the human antagonist of the second game. He is also, by the evidence in his own logs, something considerably more complicated than that. When the outbreak begins, his order is to evacuate the public sector, and he tasks his forces with getting as many civilians out as possible before the infected overrun the area. Only after that does he recall surviving security personnel to the government sector. That order was given directly against the wishes of his superiors. The man in charge of the facility that mined Isaac Clarke's brain for 3 years is also the man who defied his own chain of command to evacuate civilians while the station died around him. Both of those are the same person on the same day, and his other order, the one that makes him the antagonist, has a logic behind it that is not stupid. Everyone who came into contact with the marker was to be killed by station security, because the marker's architects are required for its activation. Killing Isaac and Strauss was, in his understanding, the way to stop the process. So here is where the case sits by 2511. An engineer who lost his girlfriend has been held without trial for 3 years and used as living hardware. The man who did that to him is trying to have him killed, for reasons that would be defensible if the man had not created the situation in the first place. And a station carrying a civilian population in the millions is sitting on top of a brand new artifact built out of a prisoner's memories. The dead start walking about 10 minutes after Isaac wakes up. Chapter 14. A city with a marker in the basement. The Ishimura was a workplace. Titan Station is a home. That difference reorganizes the entire horror, and it is the reason the second game feels so unlike the first, despite using the same creatures. The sprawl has schools, it has apartments, shopping concourses, transit systems, a church, a hospital, and families who have lived there for years. When the outbreak begins, the people running through those corridors are not miners on a contract. They are commuters, children, a population that has no relationship to any of this and no idea it was ever at risk. Isaac witnesses the panic from the very start, and the panic is the point. In the first game he arrived after everything was already over, walking through the aftermath of somebody else's catastrophe. Here he is inside it while it happens, surrounded by people dying in real time in the place where they raised their kids. His first ally is not an ally. Dana Lugian guides him out of the mental ward, tells him it has been 3 years, explains the director's marker project, and offers him the one thing he needs above everything else, which is a cure for the dementia that is killing him. When he reaches her, 2 guards seize him. She is a unitologist sent to recover him. Her position is that he is responsible for building the marker causing the current infestation, and that the church needs him to build more. Her actual intent is the detail that should stop you cold. She wanted dozens of new markers distributed throughout human space so that the entire species would be consumed. That is not a plan to seize power. That is not extortion or leverage or a bid for control of a resource. She wanted every human being to die, and she wanted it because she genuinely believed that dying together is the promised reward. The church has been in this story since the first game, and this is the moment its theology completes itself. Every element that seemed merely cynical earlier resolves into something with an actual endpoint. Unitology is not a religion that tolerates the apocalypse. Unitology is a delivery system for it, staffed by volunteers, funded by tithes, and populated by people who will hand you over to it while telling you that they are saving you. Before they can take Isaac into stasis, a security gunship guns down Dana and her associates. Notice how that plays for him. The government that imprisoned and experimented on him for 3 years just saved his life by killing the woman who was going to help him, and both parties want him for the same underlying reason, which is that his head contains the schematics. He turns to Strauss, and the 2 men who were used to build the object decide to destroy it. They pick up Ellie Langford along the way, a CEC heavy equipment pilot, and the sole survivor of her crew, who joins them because she needs their help to survive. I want to give Ellie her proper weight, because she is the most important structural change in the trilogy, and people tend to file her as a sidekick. Isaac has been alone for 2 games. He has been alone in the specific way that makes people unreachable, which is that everyone who has spoken to him for 3 years has either been a hallucination, a handler, or someone using him. His only continuous companion has been a dead woman assembled out of his own grief by an alien signal. Ellie is a living person who tells him the truth, has her own competence, and needs nothing from his head. That is the actual cure, and the game is smart enough to make it a plot mechanic rather than a sentiment. The director fights them the entire way, and the escalation of his methods is worth listing because it demonstrates what an institution will do to its own infrastructure to stop a problem it created. When Isaac reactivates the station's decommissioned solar arrays, the director redirects that focused beam of energy to slice through every connection between the civilian areas and the section of the station holding the marker, cutting the sprawl in two. He cut his own city in half with a solar weapon. Isaac's response is the most Isaac thing in the trilogy. He uses the gravity tethers of the docked Ishimura to drag the severed section back toward the rest of the station. The ship that started all of this is parked in the sprawl's dock. EarthGov recovered it, kept it, and it is sitting there, refitted and repurposed, and still functioning. And the man who was the last human being aboard her walks her corridors again in the middle of the second disaster. Nobody in that government looked at the Ishimura and thought it should be destroyed. They looked at her and saw a working planet cracker with a lot of remaining service life. Then comes the part with Strauss, and it is the ugliest sequence in the game for reasons that have nothing to do with monsters. The closer they get to the marker, the more unstable he becomes. He attacks Ellie and takes one of her eyes. Later he comes for Isaac, who overpowers him and puts him down. Understand the trap. Isaac had every reason to believe Strauss was essential, since Strauss had also helped build the object. Keeping him alive was the strategically correct decision, right up until it was not, and the moment it stopped being correct, arrived without warning and cost a friend an eye. That is the actual mechanic of marker exposure. Not a switch, a slope, walked by a person who is still speaking in complete sentences and still capable of arguing for his own reliability. Isaac and Ellie breach the government sector using a mining drill, which also allows the Necromorphs through, because in this series every entrance is a two-way door. Then he puts her on an escape shuttle and remotely commands it to launch without him. He does exactly what the marker wants in that moment, which is to be alone with only Nicole for company. He does it anyway, because the alternative is her dying with him. He breaches the perimeter, and the horde converges on the marker. He confronts the director and is forced to kill him, and then the Nicole vision pulls him into his own mind. Here is the reveal that reframes both games, delivered inside the head of a man who has been carrying it since Aegis VII. The only way for the marker to be reborn is to absorb the body and mind of the one who witnessed it, the one whose mind was used to construct it. Everything it did to him was a retrieval operation. Every appearance of Nicole, every rescue, every encouragement, every moment of guidance across two catastrophes. The hallucination that helped him survive the Ishimura was making sure the blueprint stayed alive and mobile long enough to be delivered back to the thing that shaped it. He was never being haunted. He was being escorted, and the woman doing the escorting was constructed out of his memory of the person he loved most, which means the entire apparatus was built from material he supplied himself. He fights the vision, destroys it, and rids his mind of the marker's influence. The marker explodes in the process. Let me be exact about what that means, because it is the single most cathartic beat in the franchise, and it is easy to misread as a boss fight. The object could not survive in his head without his cooperation. The vision needed him to accept it. The moment Isaac Clarke refused to be haunted, the structure collapsed, and it collapsed in both directions at once, taking the physical marker with it. He does not shoot his way out of grief. He stops agreeing with it. Exhausted, he slumps down and prepares to accept his fate as the station begins to collapse around him. Then Ellie crashes a shuttle through the ceiling. The person he sent away comes back for him. After 2 games in which every relationship was extraction, manipulation, or hallucination, the ending of Dead Space 2 is a living human being who returns. Titan Station is destroyed. The Site-12 marker is destroyed with it. And in the closing moments, a voice belonging to an official, designated the Overseer, receives the report and responds that the other sites will have to pick up the pieces. The program continues. 1 node of it was lost, along with a station full of civilians, and the response of the organization is a scheduling note. That single line does more damage to any hope in this story than the entire Necromorph horde. Everything Isaac survived, everything the director destroyed, everything Ellie lost an eye for, registers at the top of that institution as an operational setback. The consequences do not stay contained. The Titan Station disaster produces a crisis for EarthGov, and anti-government sentiment rises sharply among the general population. Millions dead on a civilian station under a government program. The public does not know the details. They know enough, and in a human sphere already saturated with a church that promises salvation, and a state that has just presided over the destruction of a city in space, that anger is going to find somewhere to go. We are going to zoom all the way out now, because the pattern is finally complete enough to diagnose, and the diagnosis explains why the last act of this story goes the way it does. Chapter 15. Diagnosing the System. I want to step back from the individual bodies for a while. We have followed this case for 3 centuries. We have watched research teams, expeditions, governments, corporations, colonies, and one enormous station all arrive at the same ending. What I want to do here is treat the whole thing the way an investigator treats a series of incidents that were originally filed separately, which is to ask whether they are actually one event. They are, and the thing that connects them is not the markers. Remove every marker from this timeline, and the institutional behavior stays identical, because the behavior was never a response to the artifact. The artifact simply arrived and found a species already organized in exactly the shape it needed. Let me lay out the 4 failures, because each one repeats with almost no variation. The first is that the decision makers are never the exposed. At Chicxulub, the men who authorized the excavation were not in the crater. During the marker test program, the council that approved deployment was not on Aspera or Cremar or Aegis VII. At Tau Volantis, the general of the army who authorized Scenario 5 was not on the ice. On the Ishimura, the church officials who arranged for a captain to be placed aboard were not in the cargo bay. At Site 12, the overseer receiving the report was not on the sprawl. Every single time, the people who chose the risk were separated from the people who absorbed it, not by accident, by design, since the entire structure of these organizations is built to route authority upward and consequence downward. There is a well-documented dynamic here that has nothing to do with fiction. Research on risk perception has consistently found that people evaluate danger very differently depending on whether they will personally bear it, and that risk becomes far more acceptable to decision makers when its costs land on someone else, particularly on people they will never meet. Distance does something specific to the moral weight of a decision. It converts a person into a number, and numbers are easy to trade. The second failure is that the warning always arrives as a health complaint. Insomnia, headaches, depression, dementia. That is the opening sequence every single time, and it is always initially handled by a doctor or a supervisor rather than by anyone with authority over the operation. This matters more than any other detail in the case. A catastrophic containment failure that presents as an occupational health issue will be routed to the department least equipped to stop it. Human resources cannot halt a mining operation. A ship's medical officer cannot ground a flagship. By the time the symptom set escalates into something that reaches the command level, the escalation takes the form of a homicide, and by then the process already has what it needs. The colony on Aegis VII had a homicide connected to sleeplessness, and management did not take it seriously. And the honest reason is that violence is a familiar problem with a familiar response, while an alien signal is not on any form. Institutions do not fail to see the evidence. They see it, classify it correctly according to their own procedures, and the correct classification is the fatal one. The third failure is that every organization treats the artifact as a resource. This one is nearly universal in the timeline, and I count only a handful of exceptions across 300 years. Altman tried to warn people and was killed for it. Kine tried to destroy the ship and the object together and was stopped. Vincent recorded a warning that both must be destroyed, and the recording became a lure. Sam Caldwell refused an order to end his own life, and eventually could not survive the isolation. Tiedemann, whatever else he was, defied his superiors to evacuate civilians, set them against everyone else. The sovereign colonies wanted the energy. The church wanted the salvation. The CEC wanted the minerals and the contract. EarthGov wanted the power and the strategic advantage. Dana wanted the extinction. 5 institutions, one shared assumption, which is that the correct thing to do with something dangerous and valuable is to acquire it before someone else does. The fourth failure is the one that guarantees the repetition, and it is the reason this whole case is a tragedy rather than merely a horror story. Nobody is ever allowed to learn. Every organization that gains real understanding of the markers destroys that understanding immediately afterward, or has it destroyed for them. The sovereign colonies burned their own research and executed their own scientists. Serrano cut up the one specimen that could have taught the species anything and hid the pieces. The codex was wiped by the man who ordered the purge. The survivors of Aegis VII were interrogated and used rather than debriefed and believed. Isaac Clarke's testimony was never treated as testimony at all because he had been certified insane by the people holding him. Knowledge in this universe is only ever collected by parties who intend to use it, and destroyed by parties who intend to hide it. There is no third category, no independent body, no scientific commons, no public record, nowhere for a warning to be deposited safely. Which brings me to the central point of the entire case, and the reason I have framed all of this as a crime rather than as a monster story. The Necromorphs have never killed anyone in this timeline without help. Every outbreak required a human decision. Somebody had to bring the object closer. Somebody had to overrule the person raising the alarm. Somebody had to classify a warning as a personnel issue. Somebody had to decide that the schedule mattered more than the incident report. The process does not break in. It waits to be carried inside by people who have excellent reasons. And here is what I have been building toward since the first chapter, the thing that makes the final act of this story land the way it does. If a system reliably produces this outcome, across 3 centuries, 4 governments, and every kind of organization humans have invented, then the outcome is not an accident of the system. It is a product of it. That is the uncomfortable conclusion, and it is where a lot of people want to stop, because it lets us blame corporations and governments and religions and go to sleep feeling clear-eyed about it. I do not think the series stops there. I think there is one more layer, and it is waiting on a frozen planet at the edge of nowhere. Everything I have described in this chapter assumes that human institutions failed on their own, through ordinary greed and ordinary cowardice and ordinary bureaucratic drift. Under that reading, the markers are inert objects that people foolishly picked up. There is a different reading, and it becomes available only once you know what Serrano found under the ice. Consider what we have already established without commenting on it. The signal draws people in. The visions target grief specifically. The distress beacon from the Ishimura was launched by a woman who was manipulated into launching it. The artifact holds the Necromorphs back, rather than commanding them. The energy readings that made every institution in 3 centuries reach for these objects were the first thing anyone noticed, every single time. Free energy is the bait, and bait implies something with an appetite, sitting patiently at the other end of a very long line. We are going to go and find it now. There is a planet at the origin of the master signal, frozen solid by a civilization that killed itself to hold the door shut. 200 years of live mines are still floating in orbit. A dismembered specimen is still hidden in the ice, along with a scientist's crippled body and a lieutenant who died alone at the top of a tower waiting for a transmission that never came. And humanity is finally coming back, because a fanatic with a fleet has decided that the only way to save the species is to finish what the aliens started. Chapter 16. The Man with the Better Argument. 3 years after Titan Station, the anger finds a leader. His name is Jacob Arthur Danick, and almost nothing about his past is recorded. What is established is that he was a devout believer, and that he built a Unitologist terrorist cell called the Circle, with the goal of bringing about what he described as the final evolution of humanity by making them one with the Necromorphs. To do it, he intended to overthrow Earth's government and to eliminate Isaac Clarke before Isaac could destroy any more markers. I want to take Danick seriously because he is the most articulate antagonist in the franchise, and dismissing him as a fanatic causes you to miss what the story is actually doing with him. Look at the environment he emerges into. The Sprawl has been destroyed with millions of civilians aboard. The disaster was caused by a government research program conducted in secret on a civilian station. Anti-government sentiment across human space has risen sharply, and the population has been living for 3 centuries inside a resource collapse that no administration has ever come close to solving. Danik walks into that and says the government has been lying to you, that they have been hiding something enormous, and that they destroyed a city rather than admit it. Every part of that is true. That is the trap the series lays for the audience, and it is beautifully constructed. The man's factual case against EarthGov is airtight. His documentation is real. His grievances are legitimate. And the conclusion he draws from all of it is that every human being should be fed into an alien reproductive cycle. There is a real observation about radicalization here that the writing gets right without ever lecturing. Movements that recruit successfully rarely begin with an absurd claim. They begin with an accurate one. The accurate grievance establishes credibility, and credibility is the currency that lets the absurd conclusion travel. People are not usually persuaded into extremity by being lied to at the start. They are persuaded by being told a truth nobody else would admit, and then trusting the source that told it. Danik's followers are not fools. They are people who were correct about their government. His campaign is methodical. He works to locate Tau Volantis, and when Robert Norton destroys the only marker in the system to prevent the Circle from following, Danik does not give up. He travels to the New Horizons lunar colony and releases a marker from a test lab there, a test lab on the moon, near Earth. Everything I said in Chapter 15 about institutions treating these objects as resources gets its final confirmation in that one detail, after Aegis VII, after the Valor. After Site 12 and the destruction of the Sprawl and millions dead, there was still a marker sitting in a laboratory on Earth's own moon. And Danik knew where it was, which means the secrecy that justified every atrocity in this timeline had already failed. The uprising spreads. EarthGov begins to come apart. Meanwhile, the man everyone is hunting has been living quietly and badly. After the Sprawl, Isaac Clarke and Ellie Langford became a couple. They broke up sometime later because of his trauma-induced emotional distance. That is such a small, ordinary, devastating line to find in the middle of a story about alien moons. Consider what it actually describes. 2 people survive something unspeakable together. She comes back for him through a ceiling. They try to build a life, and the relationship fails for the most common reason relationships fail in the real world after severe trauma, which is that one person cannot let anyone close anymore. Research on post-traumatic stress consistently identifies emotional numbing and detachment from others as core features, and describes how those features damage exactly the relationships that would otherwise support recovery. The condition attacks the treatment. Someone who has survived something catastrophic pulls away from the people who could help them, and the withdrawal is not a choice made against those people. It is a symptom pointed at them. Isaac survived 2 marker events, 3 years of non-consensual experimentation, and the discovery that his grief had been used as machinery. He was never given anything resembling care. What he was given was another mission. When we find him, he is being approached on Earth's moon by Captain Robert Norton and Sergeant John Carver, who tell him they need his help to find Ellie and her missing research team. Carver deserves his own accounting here, because his story is the cruelest small piece of the 3rd game, and it is easy to skip past. Danik, at one point, went looking for Carver's wife, Damara, and their son, Eli, and killed them. Carver later discovered their reanimated bodies. Take a moment with that. He did not lose his family in a distant outbreak. He found them, changed, and had to be the one standing in front of them. Everything about the man afterward, the hostility, the closed-off competence, the impatience with anyone who has not lost as much as he has, comes from that room. Now watch the structure the 3rd game builds out of these 3 men, because it is genuinely elegant. Norton is in love with Ellie and knows she still carries something for Isaac. Isaac is emotionally unavailable and being dragged back toward the worst thing in his life. Carver is functionally a walking grief response with a rifle. 3 damaged men and 1 woman are sent to a frozen planet at the origin of the signal that has been eating this species for 300 years. Norton later makes a deal with Danik. In exchange for Isaac Clarke, his own safety and Ellie's would be assured, and they would be allowed to leave Tal Volantis when the Circle arrived. It is the most human betrayal in the trilogy. He sells the man he sees as a rival to a terrorist in exchange for the safety of the woman he loves, and there is a version of that decision that a great many people would recognize in themselves at 3 in the morning. Isaac catches him in a private communication with Danik. Norton says it was nothing important, and Danik, of course, does not honor it. He apprehends all of them and states plainly that he intends to kill everyone, which is the outcome anyone who has ever made a deal with a movement should expect. A believer does not keep promises to unbelievers. The promise was never a contract, it was a lure. They fight and drive him off, temporarily. But the position by this point is hopeless in a way none of them fully understand, because the Circle has already reached Tal Volantis, and Tal Volantis is not a planet where anyone gets to be careful. 200 years of live mines are still in orbit. The remains of a fleet that killed itself are still up there. A frozen city is under the ice, and a machine is still running at the center of it, holding a door closed that nobody alive knows exists. And 2 groups of humans are about to fight a small war on top of the switch. Chapter 17, The Thing Under the Ice. This is the chapter where the entire case gets rewritten, so I want to walk it carefully. The expedition reaches Tal Volantis and finds the graveyard the sovereign colonies left behind. Ships that scuttled themselves 2 centuries ago. Mines still armed. A frozen world with an irregularly shaped moon hanging over it that nobody thinks to look at twice. On the surface, they find the ruins of the alien civilization, and they find the pieces of what an expedition 200 years dead was working on. Serrano's hidden specimen, the Codex. The alien machine buried beneath the ice. Everything a crippled scientist hid in the ground for a reader who did not exist yet gets found. His message went through. Isaac acquires the Codex, and then Danik attacks, and Isaac and Carver pursue him down into the planet toward the machine. And here they learn the thing that turns 3 games of horror into something with a completely different shape. With the Codex, the machine can either free the moon or destroy it. The moon, the irregular satellite that has been hanging over this planet for the entire game, the thing everybody flew past on the way in. That is the incomplete convergence. That is what the aliens of Tal Volantis froze themselves to stop. It has been up there for 2 million years, unfinished, held in stasis by a machine running on the last decision a dying species ever made. The reveal recontextualizes everything, and I want to lay out exactly what it changes. For 3 centuries, every institution in this story treated the markers as devices, energy sources, weapons, relics, objects of study. Every one of them assumed the artifact was the important thing, and that the Necromorphs were a side effect, an unfortunate byproduct of an otherwise valuable technology. The markers were never the technology. The markers are a farming implement. Follow the cycle with the ending in place and it becomes horribly clean. A signal draws an intelligent species to an artifact. The artifact offers unlimited energy, which is the one thing a technological civilization will always want badly enough to ignore warnings for. The species builds copies, spreading exposure. Exposure produces dementia and violence. Violence produces the dead. The dead become necromorphs. Necromorphs produce more dead. And when enough biomass has been accumulated in one place, it is gathered into a convergence. And what walks out of a convergence is a brethren moon, which broadcasts a signal that begins the process somewhere else. The markers do not cause outbreaks by accident. Outbreaks are the harvest. And the reason the necromorphs cannot approach a marker, the detail Alyssa Vincent discovered by accident while dying in a mining facility, finally makes sense. A farmer does not let the crop eat the seed. Every institution in this timeline believed it was acquiring an asset. Each was being counted. Now, the horror of the ending is that the humans do it to themselves anyway, in full possession of the facts. Danik captures Ellie and threatens to kill her unless he is given the Codex. To save her, Isaac hands it over. That is a good man making a human choice, and it ends the world. Danik uses the codex to turn off the machine. Understand what that moment is. A device built by a species that annihilated itself to keep it running, maintained by nothing but its own inertia for 2 million years, is switched off by a man who believes he is opening the gates of heaven. Convergence resumes. The incomplete moon, freed at last, descends toward Tau Volantis, and as it comes, it strips away the surface layers of the planet, tearing off the ice and rock under which the alien city and the machine were buried. And Jacob Danik, looking up at the thing he spent his entire life working to release, the brethren moons across the universe are fully awake now, every one of them dormant somewhere, in a system nobody has charted, following the same cycle that produced the one over Tau Volantis. The signal that has been calling humanity for 300 years was one voice. There is a network, and it has now been told exactly where the food is. Chapter 18, Take Us Home. Isaac Clarke and John Carver wake up in a frozen crevice on the surface of Tau Volantis, having fallen from a battle that by all reason should have killed them. Reaching the surface, they see the fallen moon out on the horizon. The Circle's survivors are still on that planet, and they have not stopped. A new leader has emerged, telling the remaining faithful that Danik is dead, but that belief in convergence cannot die, that a voice has spoken to him and shown him the way, and that they should evacuate all remaining ships into orbit so he can lead them. They have declared Danik their saint and their savior, on the grounds that his final actions helped awoke the brethren moons. That is not a footnote, that is the whole machine restarting in real time. A movement watches its leader die pointlessly under falling rock in the presence of the god he released, and instead of shattering, it canonizes him. Cognitive dissonance research has documented this pattern in real groups whose central prophecy failed publicly. Rather than abandoning the belief, committed members frequently reinterpret the failure as confirmation and increase their activity afterward. The more a person has sacrificed, the less available it becomes to conclude that the sacrifice bought nothing. The Circle did not lose its faith at Tau Volantis. It gained a martyr. Isaac and Carver attempt to secure a shuttle to escape and encounter this new cult, some of whom have dressed themselves to look like necromorphs. Read that image on its own for a second. A group of human beings on a dead world, styling themselves after the thing that is eating their species because they have decided that resembling it is the closest they can get to being welcomed by it. The two men fight their way to the Terra Nova, the same vessel where a lieutenant named Tucker Edwards held out alone 200 years earlier before the silence took him. They go up into the conning tower where he died to recover a shock point drive, and they haul it back to install it so they can get home. There is something almost unbearable about that. The last thing anybody does on Tau Volantis is walk into the tower where the loneliest death in the timeline happened and take a part off the wall. And through it all, the moons are speaking to Isaac. Their message, delivered through the cult leader, is that they are all awake now, awake and hungry. And then a question and an instruction. Where is it? Take us home. Make us whole. That is the point of Isaac Clarke. That is what he has been for since the first time a dead woman smiled at him on a mining ship. He was never being hunted. He was being followed. Every appearance of Nicole, every hallucination, every guidance and rescue across 3 catastrophes was navigation. The blueprint was in his head, and the blueprint knew the way to the largest concentration of human biomass in the universe. They install the drive and traverse back to Earth. When they look out of the cockpit, the brethren moons have already arrived and are attacking Earth. One of them comes up in front of the Terra Nova, seemingly crashing into the ship and knocking both men unconscious. Whether that is a hallucination or exactly what it appears to be is never resolved. The record ends there, and I want to close the case properly because the final image is the one that answers the question this whole investigation has been building toward. Go back to the very beginning. 66 million years ago, an object fell into shallow water off what is now the Yucatan Peninsula and killed almost everything on this planet. The extinction it caused cleared the ground for the mammals. From the mammals came the primates. From the primates came us. The thing that arrives at Earth in the final moments of this story is the same process that seeded it, which means the harvest was never an attack on humanity. It was a return. Somebody planted a field, waited 65 million years for it to grow, and came back at the right time. The church, in its own broken way, was closer to the truth than the government ever was, since Unitology holds that mankind was the creation of an intelligent alien force, and that the markers are the key to what comes next. They were correct about the origin. They were correct about the destination. What they got wrong was the nature of the relationship, and they got it wrong in the only way that matters. A farmer does love his crop, in a sense. He tends it and protects it and thinks about it constantly. He is not, however, planning to be reunited with it. So let me lay out the final accounting. Michael Altman told the truth and was killed by his colleagues, and his name was stolen to build the machinery that would kill millions. The sovereign colonies discovered an extinction-level threat and responded by executing their own people, destroying their own knowledge, and collapsing as a government, leaving behind a warning with no explanation attached. A corporation entered a restricted system illegally because there were minerals in it, and delivered an artifact to a ship with thousands of people aboard. A colony reported insomnia, then dementia, then a homicide, and management did not take it seriously. A government recovered the wreckage and started a new program, mined a survivor's mind for 3 years, built a marker under a civilian city, and lost the city. A zealot with a completely accurate grievance against that government used it to recruit an army, and led that army to the one place in the universe where a door was still being held shut. And 2 exhausted people killed the thing behind the door, 300 years too late, in time to be the ones who carried the address home. Every step was taken by ordinary people with defensible reasons. That is the case. There was never a mastermind in this story. What there was instead was a species with a resource crisis, a set of institutions built to convert risk into someone else's problem, and an object that offered exactly the thing they could not refuse. The markers did not need to be clever. They only needed to be valuable, and they only needed to be found by people who were desperate, ambitious, faithful, or simply doing their jobs well enough not to ask questions.